of the British service. They were Northerners, men of Derbyshire and Nottingham, the same counties which had furnished the brave militia who had taken their punishment so gamely at Roodevil. Though hustled and broken, they reformed and clung doggedly to their task, firing at the groups of Boers who surrounded the guns. At the same time, word had been sent of their pressing need to the Scotch borderers and the Scottish horse, who came swarming across the valley to the succor of their comrades. Dixon had brought 2 guns and a howitzer into action, which subdued the fire of the 2 captured pieces, and the infantry, derbies, and borderers swept over the position, retaking the 2 guns and shooting down those of the enemy who tried to stand. The greater number vanished into the smoke, which veiled their retreat as it had their advance. 41 of them were left dead upon the ground. 6 officers and 50 men killed with about 120 wounded made up the British losses, to which 2 guns would certainly have been added but for the gallant counterattack of the infantry. With Dargai and Vlakfontein to their credit, the Derbies have green laurels upon their war-worn colours. They share them on this occasion with the Scottish borderers, whose volunteer company carried itself as stoutly as the regulars. How is such an action to be summed up? To Kemp, the young Boer leader, and his men belongs the credit of the capture of the guns, to the British that of their recapture and of the final possession of the field. The British loss was probably somewhat higher than that of the Boers, but upon the other hand there could be no question as to which side could afford loss the better. The Briton could be replaced, but there were no reserves behind the fighting line of the Boers. There is one subject which cannot be ignored in discussing this battle, however repugnant it may be. That is the shooting of some of the British wounded who lay round the guns. There is no question at all about the fact, which is attested by many independent witnesses. There is reason to hope that some of the murderers paid for their crimes with their lives before the battle was over. It is pleasant to add that there is at least one witness to the fact that Boer officers interfered with threats to prevent some of these outrages. It is unfair to tarnish the whole Boer nation and cause on account of a few irresponsible villains, who would be disowned by their own decent comrades. Very many, too many, British soldiers have known by experience what it is to fall into the hands of the enemy, and it must be confessed that on the whole they have been dealt with in no ungenerous spirit, while the British treatment of the Boers has been unexampled in all military history for its generosity and humanity. That so fair a tale should be darkened by such ruffianly outrages is indeed deplorable, but the incident is too well authenticated to be left unrecorded in any detailed account of the campaign. General Dixon, finding the Boers very numerous all round him, and being hampered by his wounded, fell back upon Nieuport, which he reached on June 1st. In May, Sir Bindon Blood, having returned to the line to refit, made yet another cast through that thrice-harried belt of country which contains Ermelo, Bethel, and Carolina, in which Botha, Viljoen, and the fighting Boers had now concentrated. Working over the blackened veld, he swung round in the Barberton direction, and afterwards made a westerly drive in conjunction with small columns commanded by Walter Kitchener, Douglas, and Campbell of the Rifles, while Colville, Garnett, and Bullock operated from the Natal line. Again, the results were disappointing when compared with the power of the instrument employed. On July 5th he reached Springs near Johannesburg with a considerable amount of stock, but with no great number of prisoners. The elusive Botha had slipped away to the south and was reported upon the Zululand border, while Viljoen had succeeded in crossing the Delagoa line and winning back to his old lair in the district north of Middelburg, from which he had been evicted in April. The commandos were like those pertinacious flies which buzz upwards when a hand approaches them, but only to settle again in the same place. One could but try to make the place less attractive than before. Before Viljoen's force made its way over the line, it had its revenge for the long harrying it had undergone by a well-managed night attack, in which it surprised and defeated a portion of Colonel Beatson's column at a place called Wilmansruss, due south of Middelburg, and between that town and Bethel. Beatson had divided his force, and this section consisted of 850 of the 5th Victorian mounted rifles, with 30 gunners and 2 pom-poms, the whole under the command of Major Morris. Villejuin's force trekking north towards the line came upon this detachment upon June 12. The British were aware of the presence of the enemy, but do not appear to have posted any extra outposts or taken any special precautions. Long months of commando chasing had imbued them too much with the idea that these were fugitive sheep and not fierce and wily wolves whom they were endeavoring to catch. It is said that 700 yards separated the 4 pickets. With that fine eye for detail which the Boer leaders possess, they had started a veiled fire upon the west of the camp, and then attacked from the east, so that they were themselves invisible while their enemies were silhouetted against the light. Creeping up between the pickets, the Boers were not seen until they opened fire at point-blank range upon the sleeping men. The rifles were stacked, another noxious military tradition, and many of the troopers were shot down while they rushed for their weapons. Surprised out of their sleep and unable to distinguish their antagonists, the brave Australians did as well as any troops could have done who were placed in so impossible a position. Captain Watson, the officer in charge of the pom-poms, was shot down, and it proved to be impossible to bring the guns into action. Within 5 minutes, the Victorians had lost 20 killed and 40 wounded when the survivors surrendered. It is pleasant to add that they were very well treated by the victors, but the high-spirited colonials felt their reverse most bitterly. "It is the worst thing that ever happened to Australia," says one in the letter in which he describes it. The actual number of Boers who rushed the camp was only 180, but 400 more had formed a cordon round it. To Villejuin and his Lieutenant Muller great credit must be given for this well-managed affair, which gave them a fresh supply of stores and clothing at a time when they were hard-pressed for both. These same Boer officers had led the attack upon Helvetia, where the 4.7 gun was taken. The victors succeeded in getting away with all their trophies, and having temporarily taken one of the blockhouses on the railway near Brugsproot, they crossed the line in safety and returned, as already said, to their old quarters in the knoll, which had been harried but not denuded by the operations of General Blood. It would take a volume to catalogue and a library to entirely describe the movements and doings of the very large number of British columns, which operated over the Transvaal and the Orange River colony during this cold weather campaign. If the same columns and the same leaders were consistently working in the same districts, some system of narrative might enable the reader to follow their fortunes. But they were, as a matter of fact, rapidly transferred from one side of the field of action to another, in accordance with the concentrations of the enemy. The total number of columns amounted to at least 60, which varied in number from 200 to 2,000, and seldom hunted alone. Could their movements be marked in red upon a chart, the whole of that huge district would be crisscrossed from Tongs to Komati, and from Tews River to Petersburg, with the track of our weary but indomitable soldier. Without attempting to enter into details which would be unbecoming to the modesty of a single volume, one may indicate what the other more important groupings were during the course of these months, and which were the columns that took part in them. Of French's drive in the southeast, and of Blood's incursion into the Ruse-Senecal district, some account has been given, and of his subsequent sweeping of the south. At the same period Babington, Dixon, and Rawlinson were operating in the Klerksdorp district, though the former officer transferred his services suddenly to Blood's combination, and afterwards to Elliott's column in the north of Orange River colony. Williams and Featherstone Haw came later to strengthen this Klerksdorp district, in which, after the clearing of the Magaliesberg, de la Rey had united his forces to those of Smuts. This very important work of getting a firm hold upon the Magaliesberg was accomplished in July by Bart, Allenby, Kekewich, and Lord Basing, who penetrated into the wild country and established blockhouses and small forts in very much the same way as Cumberland and Wade in 1746 held down the Highlands. The British position was much strengthened by the firm grip obtained of this formidable stronghold of the enemy, which was dangerous not only on account of its extreme strength, but also of its proximity to the centers of population and of wealth. De la Rey, as already stated, had gone down to the Klerksdorp district, whence, for a time at least, he seems to have passed over into the north of the Orange River colony. The British pressure at Klerksdorp had become severe, and thither in May came the indefatigable Methuen, whom we last traced to Warrenton. From this point on May 1st he railed his troops to Mafeking, whence he trekked to Lichtenberg, and south, as far as his old fighting ground of Hartebeestfontein, having one skirmish upon the way, and capturing a Boer gun. Thence he returned to Mafeking, where he had to bid adieu to those veteran yeomanry, who had been his comrades on so many a weary march. It was not their fortune to be present at any of the larger battles of the war, but few bodies of troops have returned to England with a finer record of hard and useful service. No sooner, however, had Methuen laid down one weapon than he snatched up another. Having refitted his men and collected some of the more efficient of the new yeomanry, he was off once more for a 3 weeks' circular tour in the direction of Xeres. It is difficult to believe that the oldest inhabitant could have known more of the western side of the Transvaal, for there was hardly a track which he had not traversed, or a kopje from which he had not been sniped. Early in August he had made a fresh start from Mafeking, dividing his force into 2 columns, the command of the second being given to von Donapituta. Having joined hands with Featherstonhaugh, he moved through the southwest, and finally halted at Klerksdorp. The harried Boers moved 100 miles north to Russenburg, followed by Methuen, Featherstonhaugh, Hamilton, Kekewich, and Allenby, who found the commandos of De la Rey and Kemp to be scattering in front of them and hiding in the kloofs and dongas, whence in the early days of September no less than 200 were extracted. On September 6th and 8th, Methuen engaged the main body of De la Rey in the valley of the Great Marico River, which lies to the northwest of Rustenburg. In these 2 actions he pushed the Boers in front of him with a loss of 18 killed and 41 prisoners, but the fighting was severe, and 15 of his men were killed and 30 wounded before the position had been carried. The losses were almost entirely among the newly raised yeomanry, who had already shown on several occasions that, having shed their weaker members and had some experience of the field, they were now worthy to take their place beside their veteran comrades. The only other important operation undertaken by the British columns in the Transvaal during this period was in the north, where Beyers and his men were still harried by Grenfell, Collenbrander, and Wilson. A considerable proportion of the prisoners which figured in the weekly lists came from this quarter. On May 30th there was a notable action, the truth of which was much debated, but finally established, in which Kitchener's scouts under Wilson surprised and defeated a Boer force under Pretorius, killing and wounding several, and taking 40 prisoners. On July 1st, Grenfell took nearly 100 of Beyers' men with a considerable convoy, north, south, east, and west. The tale was ever the same, but so long as Botha, De la Rey, Stein, and De Wet remained uncaptured, the embers might still at any instant leap into a flame. It only remains to complete this synopsis of the movements of columns within the Transvaal that I should add that after the conclusion of Blood's movement in July, several of his columns continued to clear the country and to harass Viljoen in the Leidenburg and Dulstrom districts. Park, Kitchener, Spence, Beetson, and Benson were all busy at this work, never succeeding in forcing more than a skirmish, but continually whittling away wagons, horses, and men from that nucleus of resistance which the Boer leaders still held together. Though much hampered by the want of forage for their horses, the Boers were ever watchful for an opportunity to strike back, and the long list of minor successes gained by the British was occasionally interrupted by a petty reverse. Such a one befell the small body of South African constabulary stationed near Vereeniging, who encountered upon July 13th a strong force of Boers, supposed to be the main commando of De Wet. The constabulary behaved with great gallantry, but were hopelessly outnumbered, and lost their 7-pounder gun, 4 killed, 6 wounded, and 24 prisoners. Another small reverse occurred at a far distant point of the seat of war. For the irregular corps, known as Steinacker's Horse, was driven from its position at Bremersdorp in Swaziland upon July 24, and had to fall back 16 miles, with a loss of 10 casualties and 30 prisoners. Thus, in the heart of a native state, the two great white races of South Africa were to be seen locked in a desperate conflict. However unavoidable, the sight was certainly one to be deplored. To the Boer credit, or discredit, are also to be placed those repeated train wreckings, which cost the British during this campaign the lives and limbs of many brave soldiers who were worthy of some less ignoble fate. It is true that the laws of war sanction such enterprises, but there is something indiscriminate in the results which is repellent to humanity, and which appears to justify the most energetic measures to prevent. Women, children, and sick must all travel by these trains and are exposed to a common danger, while the assailants enjoy a safety which renders their exploit a peculiarly inglorious one. 2 Boers, Trechart and Hinden, the one a youth of 20, 2, the other a man of British birth, distinguished, or disgraced, themselves by this unsavory work upon the Delagoa line. But with the extension of the blockhouse system, the attempts became less successful. There was one, however, upon the northern line near Naboomspruit, which cost the lives of Lieutenant Best and 8 Gordon Highlanders, while 10 were wounded. The party of Gordons continued to resist after the smash and were killed or wounded to a man. The painful incident is brightened by such an example of military virtue, and by the naive reply of the last survivor, who, on being questioned why he continued to fight until he was shot down, answered with fine simplicity, "Because I am a Gordon Highlander." I don't bring one. Another train disaster of an even more tragic character occurred near Waterval, 15 miles north of Pretoria, upon the last day of August. The explosion of a mine wrecked the train, and 100 Boers who lined the banks of the cutting opened fire upon the derailed carriages. Colonel Vandeleur, an officer of great promise, was killed, and 20 men, chiefly of the West Riding Regiment, were shot. Nurse Page was also among the wounded. It was after this fatal affair that the regulation of carrying Boer hostages upon the trains was at last carried out. It has been already stated that part of Lord Kitchener's policy of concentration lay in his scheme for gathering the civil population into camps along the lines of communication. The reasons for this, both military and humanitarian, were overwhelming. Experience had proved that the men, if left at liberty, were liable to be persuaded or coerced by the fighting Boers into breaking their parole and rejoining the commandos. As to the women and children, they could not be left upon the farms in a denuded country. That the Boers in the field had no doubts as to the good treatment of these people was shown by the fact that they repeatedly left their families in the way of the columns so that they might be conveyed to the camps. Some consternation was caused in England by a report of Miss Hobhouse, which called public attention to the very high rate of mortality in some of these camps. But examination showed that this was not due to anything insanitary in their situation or arrangement, but to a severe epidemic of measles which had swept away a large number of the children. A fund was started in London to give additional comforts to these people, though there is reason to believe that their general condition was superior to that of the Uitlander refugees, who still waited permission to return to their homes. By the end of July, there were no fewer than 60,000 inmates of the camps in the Transvaal alone, and half as many in the Orange River colony. So great was the difficulty in providing the supplies for so large a number that it became more and more evident that some at least of the camps must be moved down to the seacoast. Passing to the Orange River Colony, we find that during this winter period, the same British tactics had been met by the same constant evasions on the part of the dwindling commandos. The colony had been divided into 4 military districts: that of Bloemfontein, which was given to Charles Knox; that of Lyttelton at Springfontein; that of Rundle at Harrismith; and that of Elliot in the north. The latter was infinitely the most important, and Elliot, the warden of the northern marches, had under him during the greater part of the winter a mobile force of about 6,000 men, commanded by such experienced officers as Broadwood, Doyle, and Bethune. Later in the year, Spens, Bullock, Plumer, and Remington were all sent into the Orange River Colony to help to stamp out the resistance. Numerous skirmishes and snipings were reported from all parts of the country, but a constant stream of prisoners and of surrenders assured the soldiers that, in spite of the difficulty of the country and the obstinacy of the enemy, the term of their labors was rapidly approaching. In all the petty and yet necessary operations of these columns, 2 incidents demand more than a mere mention. The first was a hard-fought skirmish in which some of Elliot's horsemen were engaged upon June 6. His column had trekked during the month of May from Kroonstad to Harrismith, and then, turning north, found itself upon that date near the hamlet of Wrights. Major Sladen, with 200 mounted infantry, when detached from the main body, came upon the track of a Boer convoy and ran it down. Over 100 vehicles with 45 prisoners were the fruits of their enterprise. Well, satisfied with his morning's work, the British leader dispatched a party of his men to convey the news to Doyle, who was behind, while he established himself with his loot and his prisoners in a convenient kraal. Thence they had an excellent view of a large body of horsemen approaching them with scouts, flankers, and all military precautions. One warm-hearted officer seems actually to have sallied out to meet his comrades, and it was not till his greeting of them took the extreme form of handing over his rifle that the suspicion of danger entered the heads of his companions. But if there was some lack of wit, there was none of heart in Sladen and his men. With 45 Boers to hold down, and 500 under Fourie, De Wet, and De la Rey around them, the little band made rapid preparation for a desperate resistance. The prisoners were laid upon their faces. The men knocked loopholes in the mud walls of the kraal, and a blunt soldierly answer was returned to the demand for surrender. But it was a desperate business. The attackers were 5 to 1, and the 5 were soldiers of De Wet, the hard-bitten veterans of 100 encounters. The captured wagons in a long double row stretched out over the plain, and under this cover the Dutchmen swarmed up to the kraal. But the men who faced them were veterans also, and the defense made up for the disparity of numbers. With fine courage, the Boers made their way up to the village and established themselves in the outlying huts, but the mounted infantry clung desperately to their position. Out of the few officers present, Findlay was shot through the head, Moyer and Cameron through the heart, and Strong through the stomach. It was a wagon hill upon a small scale, 2 dour lines of skirmishers emptying their rifles into each other at point-blank range. Once more, as at Bothaville, the British mounted infantry proved that when it came to a dogged pelting match, they could stand punishment longer than their enemy. They suffered terribly. 51 out of the little force were on the ground, and the survivors were not much more numerous than their prisoners. To the 1st Gordons, the 2nd Bedfords, the South Australians, and the New South Welshmen belongs the honor of this magnificent defense. For 4 hours the fierce battle raged, until at last the parched and powder-stained survivors breathed a prayer of thanks as they saw on the southern horizon the vanguard of Doyle riding furiously to the rescue. For the last hour, since they had despaired of carrying the kraal, the Boers had busied themselves in removing their convoy. But now, for the 2nd time in one day, the drivers found British rifles pointed at their heads, and the oxen were turned once more and brought back to those who had fought so hard to hold them. 28 killed and 26 wounded were the losses in this desperate affair. Of the Boers, 17 were left dead in front of the kraal, and the 45 had not escaped from the bulldog grip which held them. There seems for some reason to have been no effective pursuit of the Boers, and the British column held on its way to Kroonstad. The second incident which stands out amid the dreary chronicle of hustlings and snipings is the surprise visit paid by Broadwood with a small British column to the town of Wrights upon July 11th, which resulted in the capture of nearly every member of the late government of the Free State, save only the one man whom they particularly wanted. The column consisted of 200 yeomen, 200 of the 7th Dragoon Guards, and 2 guns. Starting at 11 p.m., the raiders rode hard all night, and broke with the dawn upon the sleeping village. Racing into the main street, they secured the startled Boers as they rushed from the houses. It is easy to criticize such an operation from a distance, and to overlook the practical difficulties in the way, but on the face of it, it seems a pity that the holes had not been stopped before the ferret was sent. A picket at the farther end of the street would have barred Stein's escape. As it was, he flung himself upon his horse and galloped half-clad out of the town. Sergeant Cobb of the Dragoons snapped a rifle at close quarters upon him, but the cold of the night had frozen the oil on the striker, and the cartridge hung fire. On such trifles do the large events of history turn. 2 Boer generals, 2 commandants, Stein's brother, his secretary, and several other officials were among the 29 prisoners. The treasury was also captured, but it is feared that the yeomen and dragoons will not be much the richer from their share of the contents. Save these 2 incidents, the fight at Wrights, and the capture of a portion of Stein's government at the same place, the winter's campaign furnished little which was of importance, though a great deal of very hard and very useful work was done by the various columns under the direction of the governors of the 4 military districts. In the south, General Bruce Hamilton made 2 sweeps, one from the railway line to the western frontier, and the second from the south and east in the direction of Petersburg. The result of the 2 operations was about 300 prisoners. At the same time, Munro and Hickman recleared the already twice cleared districts of Rouville and Smithfield. The country in the east of the colony was verging now upon the state which Grant described in the Shenandoah Valley. "A crow," said he, "must carry his own rations when he flies across it." In the middle district, General Charles Knox, with the columns of Pinecoffin, Thornycroft, Pilcher, and Henry, were engaged in the same sort of work with the same sort of results. The most vigorous operations fell to the lot of General Elliot, who worked over the northern and northeastern district, which still contained a large number of fighting birds. In May and June, Elliot moved across to Vrede and afterwards down the eastern frontier of the colony, joining hands at last with Rundle at Harrismith. He then worked his way back to Kroonstad through Wrights and Lindley. It was on this journey that Sladen's mounted infantry had the sharp experience which has been already narrated. Western's column, working independently, cooperated with Elliot in this clearing of the northeast side. In August, there were very large captures by Broadwood's force, which had attained considerable mobility, 90 miles being covered by it on one occasion in 2 days. Of General Rundle, there is little to be said, as he was kept busy in exploring the rough country in his own district, the same district which had been the scene of the operations against Prinsloo and the Foriesburg surrender. Into this district Kritzinger and his men tracked after they were driven from the colony in July, and many small skirmishes and snipings among the mountains showed that the Boer resistance was still alive. July and August were occupied in the Orange River colony by energetic operations of Spence and Remington's columns in the Midland districts, and by a considerable drive to the north-eastern corner, which was shared by 3 columns under Elliot and 2 under Plumer, with 1 under Henry and several smaller bodies. A considerable number of prisoners and a large amount of stock were the result of the movement, but it was very evident that there was a waste of energy in the employment of such forces for such an end. The time appeared to be approaching when a strong force of military police stationed permanently in each district might prove a more efficient instrument One interesting development of this phase of the war was the enrollment of a burgher police among the Boers who had surrendered. These men, well paid, well mounted, and well armed, were an efficient addition to the British forces. The movement spread until before the end of the war there were several thousand burghers under such well-known officers as Sellies, Villeneuve, and young Cronje, fighting against their own guerrilla country. Who, in 1899, could have prophesied such a phenomenon as that? Lord Kitchener's proclamation issued upon August 9th marked one more turn in the screw upon the part of the British authority. By it, the burghers were warned that those who had not laid down their arms by September 15th would in the case of the leaders be banished, and in the case of the burghers be compelled to support their families in the refugee camps. As many of the fighting burghers were men of no substance, the latter threat did not affect them much, but the other, though it had little result at the time, may be useful for the exclusion of firebrands during the period of Reconstruction. Some increase was noticeable in the number of surrenders after the proclamation, but on the whole, it had not the result which was expected, and its expediency is very open to question. This date may be said to mark the conclusion of the winter campaign and the opening of a new phase in the struggle. Chapter 35. The Guerrilla Operations in Cape Colony. In the account which has been given in a preceding chapter of the invasion of Cape Colony by the Boer forces, it was shown that the western bands were almost entirely expelled, or at least that they withdrew. At the time when De Wet was driven across the Orange River, this was at the beginning of March 1901. It was also mentioned that though the Boers evacuated the barren and unprofitable desert of the Karoo, the eastern bands which had come with Kritzinger did not follow the same course, but continued to infest the mountainous districts of the central colony, whence they struck again and again at the railway lines, the small towns, British patrols, or any other quarry which was within their reach and strength. From the surrounding country they gathered a fair number of recruits, and they were able through the sympathy and help of the Dutch farmers to keep themselves well mounted and supplied. In small wandering bands they spread themselves over a vast extent of country, and there were few isolated farmhouses from the Orange River to the Oudtshoorn Mountains, and from the Cape Town Railroad in the west to the Fish River in the east, which were not visited by their active and enterprising scouts. The object of the whole movement was, no doubt, to stimulate a general revolt in the colony, and it must be acknowledged that if the powder did not all explode, it was not for want of the match being thoroughly applied. It might at first sight seem the simplest of military operations to hunt down these scattered and insignificant bands, but as a matter of fact, nothing could be more difficult. Operating in a country which was both vast and difficult, with excellent horses, the best of information and supplies ready for them everywhere, it was impossible for the slow-moving British columns with their guns and their wagons to overtake them. Formidable, even in flight, the Boers were always ready to turn upon any force which exposed itself too rashly to retaliation. And so amid the mountain passes the British chiefs had to use an amount of caution which was incompatible with extreme speed. Only when a commando was exactly localized, so that 2 or 3 converging British forces could be brought to bear upon it, was there a reasonable chance of forcing a fight. Still, with all these heavy odds against them, the various little columns continued month after month to play hide-and-seek with the commandos, and the game was by no means always on the one side. The varied fortunes of this scrambling campaign can only be briefly indicated in these pages. It has already been shown that Kritzinger's original force broke into many bands, which were recruited partly from the Cape rebels and partly from fresh bodies which passed over from the Orange River colony. The more severe the pressure in the north, the greater reason was there for a trek to this land of plenty. The total number of Boers who were wandering over the eastern and midland districts may have been about 2,000, who were divided into bands which varied from 50 to 300. The chief leaders of separate commandos were Kritzinger, Scheepers, Malon, Myburg, Fouche, Lauder, Smuts, Van Reenen, Latigan, Maritz, and Conroy, the two latter operating on the western side of the country. To hunt down these numerous and active bodies, the British were compelled to put many similar detachments into the field, known as the columns of Gorringe, Crabbe, Henniker, Scobell, Doran, Kavanagh, Alexander, and others. These two sets of miniature armies performed an intricate devil's dance over the colony, the main lines of which are indicated by the red lines upon the map. The Zurberg Mountains to the north of Steinsberg, the Sneeuwberg Range to the south of Middelburg, the Outshorn Mountains in the south, the Craddock District, the Mareisburg District, and the Graf Rheinett District. These were the chief centers of Boer activity. In April, Kritzinger made his way north to the Orange River colony for the purpose of consulting with De Wet, but he returned with a following of 200 men about the end of May. Continual brushes occurred during this month between the various columns, and much hard marching was done upon either side, but there was nothing which could be claimed as a positive success. Early in May, too, passengers sailed for Europe, the journey of each being in its way historical. The first was the weary and overworked proconsul, who had the foresight to distinguish the danger and the courage to meet it. Milner's worn face and prematurely grizzled hair told of the crushing weight which had rested upon him during 3 eventful years. A gentle scholar, he might have seemed more fitted for a life of academic calm than for the stormy part which the discernment of Mr. Chamberlain had assigned to him. The fine flower of an English university, low-voiced and urbane, it was difficult to imagine what impression he would produce upon those rugged types of which South Africa is so peculiarly prolific. But, behind the reserve of a gentleman, there lay within him a lofty sense of duty, a singular clearness of vision, and a moral courage which would brace him to follow whither his reason pointed. His visit to England for 3 months' rest was the occasion for a striking manifestation of loyalty and regard from his fellow countrymen. He returned in August as Lord Milner to the scene of his labors, with the construction of a united and loyal Commonwealth of South Africa as the task of his life. The second traveler who sailed within a few days of the governor was Mrs. Botha, the wife of the Boer general, who visited Europe for private as well as political reasons. She bore to Kruger an exact account of the state of the country and of the desperate condition of the burghers. Her mission had no immediate or visible effect, and the weary war, exhausting for the British but fatal for the Boers, went steadily on. To continue the survey of the operations in the Cape, the first point scored was by the invaders. For Mallan's commando succeeded upon May 13th in overwhelming a strong patrol of the Midland Mounted Rifles, the local colonial corps, to the south of Mareisburg. 6 killed, 11 wounded, and 41 prisoners were the fruits of his little victory, which furnished him also with a fresh supply of rifles and ammunition. On May 21st, Crabbe's column was in touch with Lauder and with Latigan, but no very positive result came from the skirmish. The end of May showed considerable Boer activity in the Cape Colony, that date corresponding with the return of Kritzinger from the north. Haig had, for the moment, driven Skeepers back from the extreme southerly point which he had reached, and he was now in the Graf Rheinett district. But on the other side of the colony, Conroy had appeared near Kenhart, and upon May 23rd he fought a sharp skirmish with a party of border scouts. The main Boer force under Kritzinger was in the Midlands, however, and had concentrated to such an extent in the Craddock district that it was clear that some larger enterprise was on foot. This soon took shape, for on June 2nd, after a long and rapid march, the Boer leader threw himself upon Jamestown, overwhelmed the 60 townsmen who formed the guard, and looted the town, from which he drew some welcome supplies and 100 horses. British columns were full cry upon his heels, however, and the Boers, after a few hours, left the gutted town and vanished into the hills once more. On June 6th, the British had a little luck at last, for on that date Scobell and Lucan in the Berkeley East District surprised a laager and took 20 prisoners, 166 horses, and much of the Jamestown. On the same day, Wyndham treated Van Reenen in a similar rough fashion near Steinsburg, and took 22 prisoners. On June 8th, the supreme command of the operations in Cape Colony was undertaken by General French, who, from this time forward, maneuvered his numerous columns upon a connected plan with the main idea of pushing the enemy northwards. It was some time, however, before his disposition bore fruit, for the commandos were still better mounted and lighter than their pursuers. On June 13th, the youthful and dashing Skeepers, who commanded his own little force at an age when he would have been a junior lieutenant of the British Army, raided Murraysburg and captured a patrol. On June 17th, Munro, with Lovat scouts and Bethune's mounted infantry, had some slight success near Tarkastad. But 3 days later, the ill-fated Midland mounted rifles were surprised in the early morning by Kritzinger at Waterkloof, which is 30 miles west of Cradock, and were badly mauled by him. They lost 10 killed, 11 wounded, and 66 prisoners in this unfortunate affair. Again, the myth that colonial alertness is greater than that of regular troops seems to have been exposed. At the end of June, Foch, one of the most enterprising of the guerrilla chiefs, made a dash from Barkley east into the native reserves of the Transkei in order to obtain horses and supplies. It was a desperate measure, as it was vain to suppose that the warlike Kaffirs would permit their property to be looted without resistance, and if once the assegais were reddened, no man could say how far the mischief might go. With great loyalty, the British government, even in the darkest days, had held back those martial races, Zulus, Swazes, and Basutos, who all had old grudges against the Amabu. Foch's raid was stopped, however, before it led to serious trouble. A handful of Griqualand mounted rifles held it in front, while Dalgety and his colonial veterans, moving very swiftly, drove him back northwards. Though balked, Foch was still formidable, and on July 14th he made a strong attack in the neighborhood of Jamestown upon a column of Connaught Rangers who were escorting a convoy. Major Moore offered a determined resistance, and eventually, after some hours of fighting, drove the enemy away and captured their laager. 7 killed and 17 wounded were the British losses in this spirited engagement. On July 10th, General French, surveying from a lofty mountain peak the vast expanse of the field of operations, with his heliograph, calling up responsive twinkles over 100 miles of country, gave the order for the convergence of 4 columns upon the valley in which he knew Sheepers to be lurking. We have it from one of his own letters that his commando at the time consisted of 240 men, of whom 40 were Free Staters and the rest colonial rebels. Crewe, Wyndham, Doran, and Scobell each answered to the call, but the young leader was a man of resource, and a long kloof up the precipitous side of the hill gave him a road to safety. Yet, the operations showed a new mobility in the British columns, which shed their guns and their baggage in order to travel faster. The main commando escaped, but 25 laggards were taken. The action took place among the hills 30 miles to the west of Graf Reinet. On July 21st, Crabbe and Kritzinger had a skirmish in the mountains near Cradock, in which the Boers were strong enough to hold their own. But on the same date, near Murraysburg, Lucan, the gallant colonial gunner, with 90 men rode into 150 of Latigan's band and captured 10 of them with 100 horses. On July 27th, a small party of 21 Imperial Yeomanry was captured after a gallant resistance by a large force of Boers at the Dorne River on the other side of the column. The Kaffir scouts of the British were shot dead in cold blood by their captors after the action. There seems to be no possible excuse for the repeated murders of colored men by the Boers, as they had themselves from the beginning of the war used their Kaffirs for every purpose short of actually fighting. The war had lost much of the good humor which marked its outset. A fiercer feeling had been engendered on both sides by the long strain, but the execution of rebels by the British, though much to be deplored, is still recognized as one of the rights of a belligerent. When one remembers the condemnation upon the part of the British of the use of their own uniforms by the Boers, of the wholesale breaking of paroles, of the continual use of expansive bullets, of the abuse of the pass system, and of the Red Cross, it is impossible to blame them for showing some severity in the stamping out of armed rebellion within their own colony. If stern measures were eventually adopted, it was only after extreme leniency had been tried and failed. The loss of 5 years' franchise as a penalty for firing upon their own flag is surely the most gentle correction which an empire ever laid upon a rebellious people. At the beginning of August, the connected, systematic work of French's columns began to tell. In a huge semicircle, the British were pushing north, driving the guerrillas in front of them. Scheepers, in his usual wayward fashion, had broken away to the south, but the others had been unable to penetrate the cordon and were herded over the Stormberg to Newport line. The main body of the Boers was hustled swiftly along from August 7th to August 10th, from Grafreni to the Bus, and thrust over the railway line at that point with some loss of men and a great shedding of horses. It was hoped that the blockhouses on the railroad would have held the enemy, but they slipped across by night and got into the Steensburg district, where Goring's colonials took up the running. On August 18th, he followed the commandos from Steinsburg to Venterstad, killing 20 of them and taking several prisoners. On the 15th, Kritzinger, with the main body of the invaders, passed the Orange River near Bethune and made his way to the Weaponer district of the Orange River colony. Scheepers, Lauder, Ladigan, and a few small wandering bands were the only Boers left in the colony, and to these the British columns now turned their attention, with the result that Ladigan, towards the end of the month, was also driven over the river. For the time, at least, the situation seemed to have very much improved, but there was a drift of Boers over the north-western frontier, and in the long, continued warfare at their own doors was undoubtedly having a dangerous effect upon the Dutch farmers. Small successes from time to time, such as the taking of 60 of French's scouts by Theron's commando on August 10th, served to keep them from despair. Of the guerrilla bands which remained, the most important was that of Scheepers, which now numbered 300 men, well mounted and supplied. He had broken back through the cordon and made for his old haunts in the southwest. Theron, with a smaller band, was also in the Uniondale and Willowmore district, approaching close to the sea in the Mossel Bay direction, but being headed off by Cavendish. Scheepers turned in the direction of Cape Town, but swerved aside at Montagu and moved northwards towards Tews River. So far, the British had succeeded in driving and injuring, but never in destroying, the Boer bands. It was a new departure, therefore, when, upon September 4th, the commando of Lauder was entirely destroyed by the column of Scobell. This column consisted of some of the Cape Mounted Rifles and of the indefatigable 9th Lancers. It marked the enemy down in a valley to the west of Cradock and attacked them in the morning, after having secured all the approaches. The result was a complete success. The Boers threw themselves into a building and held out valiantly, but their position was impossible, and after enduring considerable punishment, they were forced to hoist the white flag. 11 had been killed, 46 wounded, and 56 surrendered, figures which are in themselves a proof of the tenacity of their defense. Lauder was among the prisoners. 260 horses were taken, and a good supply of ammunition, with some dynamite. A few days later, on September 10th, a similar blow, less final in its character, was dealt by Colonel Crabbe to the commando of Van der Merwe, which was an offshoot of that of Scheepers. The action was fought near Langsburg, which is on the main line, just north of Magisfontein, and it ended in the scattering of the Boer bandits, the death of their boy leader, he was only 18 years of age, and the capture of 37 prisoners. 70 of the Boers escaped by a hidden road. To colonials and yeomanry belongs the honor of the action, which cost the British force 7 casualties. Colonel Crabbe pushed on after the success, and on September 14th he was in touch with Skeeper's commando near Ladysmith, not to be confused with the historical town of Natal, and inflicted some losses. On the 17th, a patrol of Grenadier Guards was captured in the north of the colony. Rebo, the young lieutenant in charge of them, meeting with a soldier's death. On the same day, a more serious engagement occurred near Tarkastad, a place which lies to the east of Craddock, a notorious center of disaffection in the Midland district. Smuts's commando, some hundreds strong, was marked down in this part, and several forces converged upon it. One of the outlets, Ellen's Riverport, was guarded by a single squadron of the 17th Lancers. Upon this, the Boers made a sudden and very fierce attack, their approach being facilitated partly by the mist and partly by the use of khaki, a trick which seems never to have grown too stale for successful use. The result was that they were able to ride up to the British camp before any preparations had been made for resistance, and to shoot down a number of the Lancers before they could reach their horses. So terrible was the fire that the single squadron lost 34 killed and 36 wounded. But the regiment may console itself for the disaster by the fact that the sorely stricken detachment remained true to the spirited motto of the corps, and that no prisoners appear to have been lost. After this one sharp engagement, there ensued several weeks during which the absence of historical events, or the presence of the military censor, caused a singular lull in the account of the operation. With so many small commandos and so many pursuing columns, it is extraordinary that there should not have been a constant succession of action. That there was not must indicate a sluggishness upon the part of the pursuers, and this sluggishness can only be explained by the condition of their horses. Every train of thought brings the critic back always to the great horse question, and encourages the conclusion that there, at all seasons of the war and in all scenes of it, is to be found the most damning indictment against British foresight, common sense, and power of organization. That the third year of the war should dawn without the British forces having yet got the legs of the Boers, after having penetrated every portion of their country and having the horses of the world on which to draw, is the most amazingly inexplicable point in the whole of this strange campaign. From the telegram infantry preferred addressed to a nation of rough riders, down to the failure to secure the excellent horses on the spot, while importing them unfit for use from the ends of the earth, there has been nothing but one long series of blunders in this, the most vital question of all. Even up to the end, in the colony the obvious lesson had not yet been learnt that it is better to give 1,000 men 2 horses each, and to let them reach the enemy, than give 2,000 men 1 horse each, with which they can never attain their object. The chase during 2 years of the man with 2 horses by the man with 1 horse has been a sight painful to ourselves and ludicrous to others. In connection with this account of operations within the colony, there is one episode which occurred in the extreme north-west which will not fit in with this connected narrative, but which will justify the distraction of the reader's intelligence. For few finer deeds of arms are recorded in the war. This was the heroic defense of a convoy by the 14th Company of Irish Imperial Yeomanry. The convoy was taking food to Greekatown, on the Kimberley side of the seat of war. The town had been long invested by Conroy, and the inhabitants were in such straits that it was highly necessary to relieve them. To this end, a convoy, 2 miles long, was dispatched under Major Humby of the Irish Yeomanry. The escort consisted of 75 Northumberland Fusiliers, 24 local troops, and 100 of the 74th Irish Yeomanry. 15 miles from Greekatown, at a place called Ruikopjes, the convoy was attacked by the enemy several hundred in number. 2 companies of the Irishmen seized the ridge, however, which commanded the wagons, and held it until they were almost exterminated. The position was covered with bush, and the 2 parties came to the closest of quarters, the yeomen refusing to take a backward step, though it was clear that they were vastly outnumbered. Encouraged by the example of Madon and Ford, their gallant young leaders, They deliberately sacrificed their lives in order to give time for the guns to come up and for the convoy to pass. Olaf, Boninge, and McLean, who had been children together, were shot side by side on the ridge and afterwards buried in one grave. Of 43 men in action, 14 were killed and 20 severely wounded. Their sacrifice was not in vain, however. The Boers were beaten back, and the convoy, as well as Griquatown, was saved. Some 30 or 40 Boers were killed or wounded in the skirmish, and Conroy, their leader, declared that it was the stiffest fight of his life. In the autumn and winter of 1901, General French had steadily pursued the system of clearing certain districts, one at a time, and endeavoring by his blockhouses and by the arrangement of his forces to hold in strict quarantine those sections of the country which were still infested by the commandos. In this manner he succeeded by the November of this year in confining the active forces of the enemy to the extreme northeast and to the southwest of the peninsula. It is doubtful if the whole Boer force, 3/4 of whom were colonial rebels, amounted to more than 1,500 men. When we learn that at this period of the war they were indifferently armed, and that many of them were mounted upon donkeys, it is impossible, after making every allowance for the passive assistance of the farmers and the difficulties of the country, to believe that the pursuit was always pushed with the spirit and vigor which was needful. In the northeast, Myburgh, Wessels, and the truculent Fouche were allowed almost a free hand for some months, while the roving bands were rounded up in the Midlands and driven along until they were west of the main railroad. Here, in the Calvinia district, several commandos united in October 1901 under Maritz, Lau, Smith, and Therrett. Their united bands rode down into the rich grain-growing country round Picketburgh and Malmesbury, pushing south until it seemed as if their academic supporters at Parle were actually to have a sight of the rebellion which they had fanned to a flame. At one period, their patrols were within 40 miles of Cape Town. The movement was checked, however, by a small force of lancers and district troops, and towards the end of October, Maritz, who was chief in this quarter, turned northwards, and on the 29th captured a small British convoy which crossed his line of march. Early in November he doubled back and attacked Picketburgh, but was beaten off with some loss. From that time a steady pressure from the south and east drove these bands farther and farther into the great barren lands of the west, until, in the following April, they had got as far as Ngamaqaland, many hundred miles away. Upon October 9th, the second anniversary of the ultimatum, the hands of the military were strengthened by the proclamation of Cape Town and all the seaport towns as being in a state of martial law. By this means, a possible source of supplies and recruits for the enemy was effectually blocked. That it had not been done 2 years before is a proof of how far local political considerations can be allowed to override the essentials of imperial policy. Meanwhile, treason courts were sitting, and sentences, increasing rapidly from the most trivial to the most tragic, were teaching the rebel that his danger did not end upon the field of battle. The execution of Lauder and his lieutenants was a sign that the patience of a long-suffering empire had at last reached an end. The young Boer leader, Scheepers, had long been a thorn in the side of the British. He had infested the southern districts for some months, and he had distinguished himself both by the activity of his movements and by the ruthless vigor of some of his actions. Early in October, a serious illness and consequent confinement to his bed brought him at last within the range of British mobility. On his recovery he was tried for repeated breaches of the laws of war, including the murder of several natives. He was condemned to death, and was executed in December. Much sympathy was excited by his gallantry and his youth. He was only 23. On the other hand, our word was pledged to protect the natives, and if he whose hand had been so heavy upon them escaped, all confidence would have been lost in our promises and our justice. That British vengeance was not indiscriminate was shown soon afterwards in the case of a more important commander, Kritzinger, who was the chief leader of the Boers within Cape Colony. Kritzinger was wounded and captured while endeavoring to cross the line near Hanover Road upon December 15th. He was put upon his trial, and his fate turned upon how far he was responsible for the misdeeds of some of his subordinates. It was clearly shown that he had endeavored to hold them within the bounds of civilized warfare, and with congratulations and handshakings, he was acquitted by the military court. In the last 2 months of the year 1901, a new system was introduced into the Cape Colony campaign by placing the colonial and district troops immediately under the command of colonial officers and of the colonial government. It had long been felt that some devolution was necessary, and the change was justified by the result. Without any dramatic incident, an inexorable process of attrition caused by continual pursuit and hardship wore out the commandos. Large bands had become small ones, and small ones had vanished. Only by the union of several bodies could any enterprise higher than the looting of a farmhouse be successfully attempted. Such a union occurred, however, in the early days of February 1902, when Smuts Malin and several other Boer leaders showed great activity in the country round Calvinia. Their commandos seem to have included a proportion of veteran Republicans from the north, who were more formidable fighting material than the raw colonial rebels. It happened that several dangerously weak British columns were operating within reach at that time, and it was only owing to the really admirable conduct of the troops that a serious disaster was averted. 2 separate actions, each of them severe, were fought on the same date, and in each case the Boers were able to bring very superior numbers into the field. The first of these was the fight in which Colonel Doran's column extricated itself with severe loss from a most perilous plight. The whole force under Doran consisted of 350 men with 2 guns, and this handful was divided by an expedition which he, with 150 men, undertook in order to search a distant farm. The remaining 200 men under Captain Saunders were left upon February 5th with the guns and the convoy at a place called Middelpost, which lies about 50 miles southwest of Calvinia. These men were of the 11th, 23rd, and 24th Imperial Yeomanry, with a troop of Cape Police. The Boer intelligence was excellent, as might be expected in a country which is dotted with farms. The weakened force at Middelpost was instantly attacked by Smuts's commando. Saunders evacuated the camp and abandoned the convoy, which was the only thing he could do, but he concentrated all his efforts upon preserving his guns. The night was illuminated by the blazing wagons and made hideous by the whoops of the drunken rebels who caroused among the captured stores. With the first light of dawn, the small British force was fiercely assailed on all sides, but held its own in a manner which would have done credit to any troops. The much criticized yeomen fought like veterans. A considerable position had to be covered, and only a handful of men were available at the most important points. One ridge, from which the guns would be enfiladed, was committed to the charge of Lieutenants Tabor and Chichester with 11 men of the 11th Imperial Yeomanry, their instructions being to hold it to the death. The order was obeyed with the utmost heroism. After a desperate defense, the ridge was only taken by the Boers when both officers had been killed and 9 out of 11 men were on the ground. In spite of the loss of this position, the fight was still sustained until shortly after midday, when Doran, with the patrol, returned. The position was still most dangerous, the losses had been severe, and the Boers were increasing in strength. An immediate retreat was ordered, and the small column, after 10 days of hardship and anxiety, reached the railway line in safety. The wounded were left to the care of Smuts, who behaved with chivalry and humanity. At about the same date, a convoy proceeding from Beaufort west to Fraserburg was attacked by Malin's commando. The escort, which consisted of 60 colonial mounted rifles and 100 of the West Yorkshire militia, was overwhelmed after a good defense in which Major Crofton, their commander, was killed. The wagons were destroyed, but the Boers were driven off by the arrival of Crabbe's column, followed by those of Capper and Lunt. The total losses of the British in these 2 actions amounted to 23 killed and 65 wounded. The re-establishment of settled law and order was becoming more marked every week in those southwestern districts, which had long been most disturbed. Colonel Crew in this region, and Colonel Lucan upon the other side of the line, acting entirely with colonial troops, were pushing back the rebels and holding, by a well-devised system of district defense, all that they had gained. By the end of February, there were none of the enemies south of the Beaufort West and Clanwilliam line. These results were not obtained without much hard marching and a little hard fighting. Small columns under Crabbe, Capper, Windham, Nickel, and Lund were continually on the move, with little to show for it save an ever-widening area of settled country in their rear. In a skirmish on February 20th, Judge Hugo, a well-known Boer leader, was killed, and Van Heerden, a notorious rebel, was captured. At the end of this month, Fouche's tranquil occupation of the northeast was at last disturbed, and he was driven out of it into the Midlands, where he took refuge with the remains of his commando in the Kamdaboo Mountains. Mallon's men had already sought shelter in the same natural fortress. Mallon was wounded and taken in a skirmish near Somerset East a few days before the General Boer surrender. Fouché gave himself up at Craddock on June 2nd. The last incident of this scattered, scrambling, unsatisfactory campaign in the Cape Peninsula was the raid made by Smuts, the Transvaal leader, into the Port Nolloth district of Namaqualand, best known for its copper mines. A small railroad has been constructed from the coast at this point, the terminus being the township of Ukipe. The length of the line is about 70 miles. It is difficult to imagine what the Boers expected to gain in this remote corner of the seat of war, unless they had conceived the idea that they might actually obtain possession of Port Nolloth itself, and so restore the communications with their sympathizers and allies. At the end of March, the Boer horsemen appeared suddenly out of the desert, drove in the British outposts, and summoned Uki to surrender. Colonel Shelton, who commanded the small garrison, sent an uncompromising reply, but he was unable to protect the railway in his rear, which was wrecked, together with some of the blockhouses which had been erected to guard it. The loyal population of the surrounding country had flocked into Ukipe, and the commandant found himself burdened with the care of 6,000 people. The enemy had succeeded in taking the small post of Springbok, and Concordia, the mining center, was surrendered into their hands without resistance, giving them welcome supplies of arms, ammunition, and dynamite. The latter was used by the Boers in the shape of hand bombs and proved to be a very efficient weapon when employed against blockhouses. Several of the British defenses were wrecked by them, with considerable loss to the garrison, but in the course of a month's siege, in spite of several attacks, the Boers were never able to carry the frail works which guarded the town. Once more, at the end of the war as at the beginning of it, there was shown the impotence of the Dutch riflemen against a British defense. A relief column under Colonel Cooper was quickly organized at Port Nolloth and advanced along the railway line, forcing Smuts to raise the siege in the first week of May. Immediately afterwards came the news of the negotiations for peace, and the Boer general presented himself at Port Nolloth, whence he was conveyed by ship to Cape Town, and so north again to take part in the deliberations of his fellow countrymen. Throughout the war, he had played a manly and honorable part. It may be hoped that with youth and remarkable experience, both of diplomacy and of war, he may now find a long and brilliant career awaiting him in a wider arena than that for which he strove. Chapter 36. The Spring Campaign, September to December 1901. The history of the war during the African winter of 1901 has now been sketched, and some account given of the course of events in the Transvaal, the Orange River Colony, and the Cape Colony. The hope of the British that they might stamp out resistance before the grass should restore mobility to the larger bodies of Boers was destined to be disappointed. By the middle of September, the veld had turned from drab to green, and the great drama was fated to last for one more act. However anxious all the British and the majority of the Boers might be to ring down the curtain. Exasperating as this senseless prolongation of a hopeless struggle might be, there was still some consolation in the reflection that those who drank this bitter cup, to the very lees, would be less likely to thirst for it again. September 15th was the date which brought into force the British proclamation announcing the banishment of those Boer leaders who continued in arms. It must be confessed that this step may appear harsh and unchivalrous to the impartial observer, so long as those leaders were guilty of no practices which are foreign to the laws of civilized warfare. The imposition of personal penalties upon the officers of an opposing army is a step for which it is difficult to quote a precedent. Nor is it wise to officially rule your enemy outside the pale of ordinary warfare, since it is equally open to him to take the same step against you. The only justification for such a course would be its complete success, as this would suggest that the intelligence department were aware that the leaders desired some strong excuse for coming in, such an excuse as the proclamation would afford. The result proved that nothing of the kind was needed, and the whole proceeding must appear to be injudicious and high-handed. In honorable war, you conquer your adversary by superior courage, strength, or wit, but you do not terrorize him by particular penalties aimed at individuals. The burghers of the Transvaal and of the late Orange Free State were legitimate belligerents, and to be treated as such, a statement which does not, of course, extend to the Afrikaner rebels who were their allies. The tendency of the British had been to treat their antagonists as a broken and disorganized banditti, but with the breaking of the spring, they were sharply reminded that the burghers were still capable of a formidable and coherent effort. The very date which put them beyond the pale as belligerents was that which they seemed to have chosen in order to prove what active and valiant soldiers they still remained. A quick succession of encounters occurred at various parts of the seat of war, the general tendency of which was not entirely in favor of the British arms, though the weekly export of prisoners reassured all who noted it as to the sapping and decay of the Boer strength. These incidents must now be set down in the order of their occurrence, with their relation to each other so far as it is possible to trace it. General Louis Botha, with the double intention of making an offensive move and of distracting the wavering burghers from a close examination of Lord Kitchener's proclamation, assembled his forces in the second week of September in the Ermelo district. Thence he moved them rapidly towards Natal, with the result that the volunteers of that colony had once more to grasp their rifles and hasten to the frontier. The whole situation bore for an instant an absurd resemblance to that of 2 years before, both playing the part of Joubert and Leilton, who commanded on the frontier, that of White. It only remained to make the parallel complete that someone should represent Penn Simons, and this perilous role fell to a gallant officer, Major Gough, commanding a detached force which thought itself strong enough to hold its own, and only learned by actual experiment that it was not. This officer, with a small force consisting of 3 companies of mounted infantry with 2 guns of the 69th RFA, was operating in the neighborhood of Utrecht in the south-eastern corner of the Transvaal, on the very path along which Botha must descend. On September 17th he had crossed a Jogger's Drift on the Blood River, not very far from Dundee, when he found himself in touch with the enemy. His mission was to open a path for an empty convoy returning from Vryheid, and in order to do so it was necessary that Blood River Port, where the Boers were now seen, should be cleared. With admirable zeal Gough pushed rapidly forward, supported by a force of 350 Johannesburg mounted rifles under Stuart. Such a proceeding must have seemed natural to any British officer at this stage of the war, when a swift advance was the only chance of closing with the small bodies of Boers. But it is strange that the intelligence department had not warned the patrols upon the frontier that a considerable force was coming down upon them, and that they should be careful to avoid action against impossible odds. If Gough had known that Botha's main commando was coming down upon him, it is inconceivable that he would have pushed his advance until he could neither extricate his men nor his guns. A small body of the enemy, said to have been the personal escort of Louis Botha, led him on, until a large force was able to ride down upon him from the flank and rear. Surrounded at Skeeper's Neck, by many hundreds of riflemen in a difficult country, there was no alternative but a surrender, and so sharp and sudden was the Boer advance that the whole action was over in a very short time. The new tactics of the Boers, already used at Vlakfontein, and afterwards, to be successful at Brekenlucht, were put in force. A large body of mounted men, galloping swiftly in open order and firing from the saddle, rode into and over the British. Such temerity should in theory have met with severe punishment, but as a matter of fact, the losses of the enemy seem to have been very small. The soldiers were not able to return an effective fire from their horses, and had no time to dismount. The sights and breech blocks of the two guns are said to have been destroyed, but the former statement seems more credible than the latter. A Colt gun was also captured. Of the small force, 20 were killed, 40 wounded, and over 200 taken. Stuart's force was able to extricate itself with some difficulty, and to fall back on the drift. Gall managed to escape that night and to report that it was Botha himself with over 1,000 men who had eaten up his detachment. The prisoners and wounded were sent in a few days later to Vryheid, a town which appeared to be in some danger of capture had not Walter Kitchener hastened to carry reinforcements to the garrison. Bruce Hamilton was at the same time dispatched to head Botha off, and every step taken to prevent his southern advance. So many columns from all parts converged upon the danger spot that Lyttleton, who commanded upon the Natal frontier, had over 20,000 men under his orders. Botha's plans appeared to have been to work through Zululand and then strike at Natal, an operation which would be the more easy as it would be conducted a considerable distance from the railway line. Pushing on a few days after his successful action with Gough, he crossed the Zulu frontier, and had in front of him an almost unimpeded march as far as the Tugela. Crossing this far from the British base of power, his force could raid the Greytown district and raise recruits among the Dutch farmers, laying waste one of the few spots in South Africa which had been untouched by the blight of war. All this lay before him, and in his path nothing save only 2 small British posts, which might be either disregarded or gathered up as he passed. In an evil moment for himself, tempted by the thought of the supplies which they might contain, he stopped to gather them up, and the force of the wave of invasion broke itself as upon 2 granite rocks. These 2 so-called forts were posts of very modest strength, a chain of which had been erected at the time of the old Zulu War. Fort Itala, the larger, was garrisoned by 300 men of the 5th Mounted Infantry, drawn from the Dublin Fusiliers, Middlesex, Dorsets, South Lancashires, and Lancashire Fusiliers, most of them old soldiers of many battles. They had 2 guns of the 69th RFA, the same battery which had lost a section the week before. Major Chapman of the Dublins was in command. Upon September 25th, the small garrison heard that the main force of the Boers was sweeping towards them, and prepared to give them a soldier's welcome. The fort is situated upon the flank of a hill, on the summit of which, a mile from the main trenches, a strong outpost was stationed. It was upon this that the first force of the attack broke at midnight of September 25th. The garrison, 80 strong, was fiercely beset by several hundred Boers, and the post was eventually carried after a sharp and bloody contest. Kane, of the South Lancashires, died with the words "No surrender" upon his lips, and Potgieter, a Boer leader, was pistoled by Kane's fellow officer, Lefroy. 20 of the small garrison fell, and the remainder were overpowered and taken. With this vantage ground in their possession, the Boers settled down to the task of overwhelming the main position. They attacked upon 3 sides, and until morning the force was raked from end to end by unseen riflemen. The 2 British guns were put out of action, and the Maxim was made unserviceable by a bullet. At dawn there was a pause in the attack, but it recommenced and continued without intermission until sunset. The span betwixt the rising of the sun and its last red glow in the west is a long one for the man who spends it at his ease. But how never ending must have seemed the hours to this handful of men. Outnumbered, surrounded, pelted by bullets, parched with thirst, torn with anxiety, holding desperately on with dwindling numbers to their frail defenses. To them it may have seemed a hard thing to endure so much for a tiny fort in a savage land. The larger view of its vital importance could have scarcely come to console the regimental officer, far less the private. But duty carried them through, and they wrought better than they knew, for the brave Dutchman, exasperated by so disproportionate a resistance, stormed up to the very trenches, and suffered as they had not suffered for many a long month. There have been battles with 10,000 British troops hotly engaged, in which the Boer losses have not been so great as in this obscure conflict against an isolated post. When at last, baffled and disheartened, they drew off with the waning light, it is said that no fewer than 100 of their dead and 200 of their wounded attested the severity of the fight. So strange are the conditions of South African warfare that this loss, which would have hardly made a skirmish memorable in the slogging days of the peninsula, was one of the most severe blows which the burghers had sustained in the course of a 2 years' warfare against a large and aggressive army. There is a conflict of evidence as to the exact figures, but at least they were sufficient to beat the Boer army back and to change their plan of campaign. Whilst this prolonged contest had raged round Fort Adala, a similar attack upon a smaller scale was being made upon Fort Prospect, some 15 miles to the eastward. This small post was held by a handful of Durham artillery militia and of Dorsets. The attack was delivered by Grobler with several hundred burghers, but it made no advance, although it was pushed with great vigor and repeated many times in the course of the day. Captain Raleigh, who was in command, handled his men with such judgment that 1 killed and 8 wounded represented his casualties during a long day's fighting. Here again the Boer losses were in proportion to the resolution of their attack, and are said to have amounted to 60 killed and wounded. Considering the impossibility of replacing the men and the fruitless waste of valuable ammunition, September 26th was an evil day for the Boer cause. The British casualties amounted to 73. The water of the garrison of Fort Itala had been cut off early in the attack, and their ammunition had run low by evening. Chapman withdrew his men and his guns therefore to Kankandla, where the survivors of his gallant garrison received the special thanks of Lord Kitchener. The country around was still swarming with Boers, and on the last day of September, a convoy from Melmoth fell into their hands and provided them with some badly needed supplies. But the check which he had received was sufficient to prevent any important advance upon the part of Botha, while the swollen state of the rivers put an additional obstacle in his way. Already the British commanders, delighted to have at last discovered a definite objective, were hurrying to the scene of action. Bruce Hamilton had reached Fort Itala upon September 28th, and Walter Kitchener had been dispatched to Vryheid. 2 British forces, aided by smaller columns, were endeavoring to surround the Boer leader. On October 6th, Botha had fallen back to the northeast of Vryheid, whither the British forces had followed him. Like De Wet's invasion of the Cape, Botha's advance upon Natal had ended in placing himself and his army in a critical position. On October 9th, he had succeeded in crossing the Priven River, a branch of the Pongolo, and was pushing north in the direction of Piet Retief, much helped by misty weather and incessant rain. Some of his force escaped between the British columns, and some remained in the kloofs and forests of that difficult country. Walter Kitchener, who had followed up the Boer retreat, had a brisk engagement with the rear guard upon October 6. The Boers shook themselves clear with some loss, both to themselves and to their pursuers. On the 10th, those of the burghers who held together had reached Lüneburg, and shortly afterwards they had got completely away from the British columns. The weather was atrocious, and the lumbering wagons, axle-deep in mud, made it impossible for troops who were attached to them to keep in touch with the light riders who sped before them. For some weeks there was no word of the main Boer force, but at the end of that time they reappeared in a manner which showed that both in numbers and in spirit they were still a formidable body. Of all the 60-odd British columns which were traversing the Boer states, there was not one which had a better record than that commanded by Colonel Benson. During 7 months of continuous service, this small force, consisting at that time of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the 2nd Scottish Horse, the 18th and 19th Mounted Infantry, and 2 guns, had acted with great energy, and had reduced its work to a complete and highly effective system. Leaving the infantry as a camp guard, Benson operated with mounted troops alone, and no Boer laager within 50 miles was safe from his nocturnal visits. So skillful had he and his men become at these night attacks in a strange and often difficult country, that out of 28 attempts 21 resulted in complete success. In each case, the rule was simply to gallop headlong into the Boer laager, and to go on chasing as far as the horses could go. The furious and reckless pace may be judged by the fact that the casualties of the force were far greater from falls than from bullets. In 7 months 47 Boers were killed and 600 captured, to say nothing of enormous quantities of munitions and stock. The success of these operations was due not only to the energy of Benson and his men, but to the untiring exertions of Colonel Wool Sampson, who acted as intelligence officer. During his long persecution by President Kruger, Wool's Sampson, in the bitterness of his heart, had vowed a feud against the Boer cause. It must be acknowledged that he has most amply fulfilled it, for it would be difficult to point to any single man who has from first to last done them greater harm. In October, Colonel Benson's force was reorganized, and it then consisted of the 2nd Buffs, the 2nd Scottish Horse, the 3rd and 25th Mounted Infantry, and 4 guns of the 84th Battery. With this force, numbering 1,900 men, he left Middelburg upon the Delagoa line on October 20th and proceeded south, crossing the course along which the Boers, who were retiring from their abortive raid into Natal, might be expected to come. For several days the column performed its familiar work and gathered up 40 or 50 prisoners. On the 26th came news that the Boer commandos under Grobler were concentrating against it, and that an attack in force might be expected. For 2 days there was continuous sniping, and the column, as it moved through the country, saw Boer horsemen keeping pace with it on the far flanks and in the rear. The weather had been very bad, and it was in a deluge of cold driving rain that the British set forth upon October 30th, moving towards Brakenlocht, which is a point about 40 miles due south of Middelburg. It was Benson's intention to return to his base. About midday the column, still escorted by large bodies of aggressive Boers, came to a difficult spruit swollen by the rain. Here the wagons stuck, and it took some hours to get them all across. The Boer fire was continually becoming more severe, and had broken out at the head of the column as well as the rear. The situation was rendered more difficult by the violence of the rain, which raised a thick steam from the ground and made it impossible to see for any distance. Major Anley, in command of the rear guard, peering back, saw through a rift of the clouds a large body of horsemen in extended order sweeping after them. "There's miles of them, begob," cried an excited Irish trooper. Next instant the curtain had closed once more, but all who had caught a glimpse of that vision knew that a stern struggle was at hand. At this moment 2 guns of the 84th Battery under Major Guinness were in action against Boer riflemen. As a rear screen on the farther side of the guns was a body of the Scottish Horse and of the Yorkshire Mounted Infantry. Near the guns themselves were 30 men of the Buffs. The rest of the Buffs and of the Mounted Infantry were out upon the flanks, or else were with the advance guard, which was now engaged, under the direction of Colonel Wool Sampson, in parking the convoy and informing the camp. These troops played a small part in the day's fighting, the whole force of which broke with irresistible violence upon the few hundred men who were in front of or around the rear guns. Colonel Benson seems to have just ridden back to the danger point when the Boers delivered their furious attack. Louis Botha, with his commando, is said to have ridden 60 miles in order to join the forces of Grobler and Opperman, and overwhelm the British column. It may have been the presence of their commander, or a desire to have vengeance for the harrying which they had undergone upon the natal border. But, whatever the reason, the Boer attack was made with a spirit and dash, which earned the enthusiastic applause of every soldier who survived to describe it. With the low roar of a great torrent, several hundred horsemen burst through the curtain of mist, riding at a furious pace for the British guns. The rear screen of mounted infantry fell back before this terrific rush, and the two bodies of horsemen came pell-mell down upon the handful of buffs and the guns. The infantry were ridden into and surrounded by the Boers, who found nothing to stop them from galloping onto the low ridge upon which the guns were stationed. This ridge was held by 80 of the Scottish Horse and 40 of the Yorkshire MI, with a few riflemen from the 25th Mounted Infantry. The latter were the escort of the guns, but the former were the rear screen who had fallen back rapidly because it was the game to do so, but who were in no way shaken, and who instantly dismounted and formed when they reached a defensive position. These men had hardly time to take up their ground when the Boers were on them. With that extraordinary quickness to adapt their tactics to circumstances, which is the chief military virtue of the Boers, the horsemen did not gallop over the crest, but lined the edge of it, and poured a withering fire onto the guns and the men beside them. The heroic nature of the defense can be best shown by the plain figures of the casualties. No rhetoric is needed to adorn that simple record. There were 32 gunners round the guns, and 29 fell where they stood. Major Guinness was mortally wounded while endeavoring with his own hands to fire a round of case. There were 62 casualties out of 80 among the Scottish Horse, and the Yorkshires were practically annihilated. Altogether, 123 men fell, out of about 160 on the ridge. Hard pounding, gentlemen, as Wellington remarked at Waterloo, and British troops seemed as ready as ever to endure it. The gunners were, as usual, magnificent. Of the two little bullet-pelted groups of men around the guns, there was not one who did not stand to his duty without flinching. Corporal Atkin was shot down with all his comrades, but still endeavored with his failing strength to twist the breech block out of the gun. Another bullet passed through his upraised hands as he did it. Sergeant Hayes, badly wounded, and the last survivor of the crew, seized the lanyard, crawled up the trail, and fired a last round before he fainted. Sergeant Matthews, with 3 bullets through him, kept steadily to his duty. 5 drivers tried to bring up a limber and remove the gun, but all of them, with all the horses, were hit. There have been incidents in this war which have not increased our military reputation, but you might search the classical records of valor and fail to find anything finer than the consistent conduct of the British artillery. Colonel Benson was hit in the knee and again in the stomach, but wounded as he was, he dispatched a message back to Wool Sampson, asking him to burst shrapnel over the ridge so as to prevent the Boers from carrying off the gun. The burghers had ridden in among the litter of dead and wounded men, which marked the British position, and some of the baser of them, much against the will of their commanders, handled the injured soldiers with great brutality. The shell fire drove them back, however, and the 2 guns were left standing alone, with no one near them, save their prostrate gunners and escort. There has been some misunderstanding as to the part played by the Buffs in this action, and words have been used which seem to imply that they had in some way failed their mounted companions. It is due to the honor of one of the finest regiments in the British Army to clear this up. As a matter of fact, the greater part of the regiment under Major Douglas was engaged in defending the camp. Near the guns, there were 4 separate small bodies of Buffs, none of which appears to have been detailed as an escort. One of these parties, consisting of 30 men under Lieutenant Greatwood, was ridden over by the horsemen, and the same fate befell a party of 20 who were far out upon the flank. Another small body under Lieutenant Lynch was overtaken by the same charge, and was practically destroyed, losing 19 killed and wounded out of 30. In the rear of the guns was a larger body of Buffs, 130 in number, under Major Eels. When the guns were taken, this handful attempted a counterattack, but Eels soon saw that it was a hopeless effort, and he lost 30 of his men before he could extricate himself. Had these men been with the others on the gun ridge, they might have restored the fight, but they had not reached it when the position was taken, and to persevere in the attempt to retake it would have led to certain disaster. The only just criticism to which the regiment is open is that, having just come off blockhouse duty, they were much out of condition, which caused the men to straggle and the movements to be unduly slow. It was fortunate that the command of the column devolved upon so experienced and cool-headed a soldier as Wolves Sampson. To attempt a counterattack for the purpose of recapturing the guns would, in case of disaster, have risked the camp and the convoy. The latter was the prize which the Boers had particularly in view, and to expose it would be to play their game. Very wisely, therefore, Wolves Sampson held the attacking Boers off with his guns and his riflemen, while every spare pair of hands was set to work entrenching the position and making it impregnable against attack. Outposts were stationed upon all those surrounding points which might command the camp, and a summons to surrender from the Boer leader was treated with contempt. All day a long-range fire, occasionally very severe, rained upon the camp. Colonel Benson was brought in by the ambulance and used his dying breath in exhorting his subordinate to hold out. No more night marches are said to have been the last words spoken by this gallant soldier as he passed away in the early morning after the action. On October 31st, the force remained on the defensive, but early on November 1st, the gleaming of two heliographs, one to the north, east, and one to the south, west, told that two British columns, those of Doyle and of Barter, were hastening to the rescue. But the Boers had passed as the storm does, and nothing but their swath of destruction was left to show where they had been. They had taken away the guns during the night, and were already beyond the reach of pursuit. Such was the action at Brakenloch, which cost the British 60 men killed and 170 wounded, together with 2 guns. Colonel Benson, Colonel Guinness, Captain Eyre Lloyd of the Guards, Major Murray and Captain Lindsay of the Scottish Horse, with 7 other officers were among the dead, while 16 officers were wounded. The net result of the action was that the British rearguard had been annihilated, but that the main body and the convoy, which was the chief object of the attack, was saved. The Boer loss was considerable, being about 150. In spite of the Boer success, nothing could suit the British better than hard fighting of the sort, since whatever the immediate result of it might be, it must necessarily cause a wastage among the enemy which could never be replaced. The gallantry of the Boer charge was only equaled by that of the resistance offered round the guns, and it is an action to which both sides can look back without shame or regret. It was feared that the captured guns would soon be used to break the blockhouse line, but nothing of the kind was attempted, and within a few weeks they were both recovered by British columns. In order to make a consecutive and intelligible narrative, I will continue with an account of the operations in this southeastern portion of the Transvaal from the action of Brakenloch down to the end of the year 1901. These were placed in the early part of November, under the supreme command of General Bruce Hamilton, and that energetic commander set in motion a number of small columns, which effected numerous captures. He was much helped in his work by the new lines of blockhouses, one of which extended from Standerton to Ermelo, while another connected Brugsbroot with Graylingstad. The huge country was thus cut into manageable districts, and the fruits were soon seen by the large returns of prisoners which came from this part of the seat of war. Upon December 3rd, Bruce Hamilton, who had the valuable assistance of Wolves Sampson to direct his intelligence, struck swiftly out from Ermelo and fell upon a Boer laager in the early morning, capturing 96 prisoners. On the 10th, he overwhelmed the Bethel commando by a similar march, killing 7 and capturing 131. Williams and Wing commanded separate columns in this operation, and their energy may be judged from the fact that they covered 51 miles during the 24 hours. On the 12th, Hamilton's columns were on the warpath once more, and another commando was wiped out. 16 killed and 70 prisoners were the fruits of this expedition. For the second time in a week, the columns had done their 50 miles a day, and it was no surprise to hear from their commander that they were in need of arrests. Nearly 400 prisoners had been taken from the most warlike portion of the Transvaal in 10 days by one energetic commander, with a list of 25 casualties to ourselves. The thanks of the Secretary of War were specially sent to him for his brilliant work. From then until the end of the year 1901, numbers of smaller captures continued to be reported from the same region where Plumer, Spence, Mackenzie, Rawlinson, and others were working. On the other hand, there was one small setback, which occurred to a body of 200 mounted infantry under Major Bridgeford, who had been detached from Spence's column to search some farmhouses at a place called Holland, to the south of Ermelo. The expedition set forth upon the night of December 19th, and next morning surrounded and examined the farms. The British force became divided in doing this work, and were suddenly attacked by several hundred of Britz's commando, who came to close quarters through their khaki dress, which enabled them to pass as Plumer's vanguard. The brunt of the fight fell upon an outlying body of 50 men, nearly all of whom were killed, wounded, or taken. A second body of 50 men were overpowered in the same way, after a creditable defense. 15 of the British were killed and 30 wounded, while Bridgeford the commander was also taken. Spence came up shortly afterwards with the column, and the Boers were driven off. There seems every reason to think that upon this occasion the plans of the British had leaked out, and that a deliberate ambush had been laid for them round the farms. But in such operations these are chances against which it is not always possible to guard. Considering the number of the Boers, and the cleverness of their dispositions, the British were fortunate in being able to extricate their force without greater loss, a feat which was largely due to the leading of Lieutenant Sterling. Leaving the Eastern Transvaal, the narrative must now return to several incidents of importance which had occurred at various points of the seat of war during the latter months of 1901. On September 19th, 2 days after Gough's disaster, a misfortune occurred near Bloemfontein by which 2 guns and 140 men fell temporarily into the hands of the enemy. These guns, belonging to U Battery, were moving south under an escort of mounted infantry from that very Sanus post which had been so fatal to the same battery 18 months before. When 15 miles south of the waterworks, at a place called Vlakfontein, another Vlakfontein from that of General Dixon's engagement, the small force was surrounded and captured by Ackermann's commando. The gunner officer, Lieutenant Barry, died beside his guns in the way that gunner officers have. Guns and men were taken, however, the latter to be released, and the former to be recovered a week or 2 later by the British columns. It is certainly a credit to the Boers that the spring campaign should have opened by 4 British guns falling into their hands, and it is impossible to withhold our admiration for those gallant farmers who, after 2 years of exhausting warfare, were still able to turn upon a formidable and victorious enemy, and to renovate their supplies at his expense. 2 days later, hard on the heels of Gough's mishap, of the Vlakfontein incident, and of the annihilation of the squadron of Lancers in the Cape, there was a serious affair at Ellen's Kloof, near Zastron, in the extreme south of the Orange River colony. In this, a detachment of the Highland Scouts raised by the public spirit of Lord Lovat was surprised at night, and very severely handled by Kritzinger's commando. The loss of Colonel Murray, their commander, of the adjutant of the same name, and of 42 out of 80 of the scouts, shows how fell was the attack, which broke as sudden and as strong as a South African thunderstorm upon the unconscious camp. The Boers appeared to have eluded the outposts and crept right among the sleeping troops, as they did in the case of the Victorians at Wilmansrust. 12 gunners were also hit, and the only field gun taken. The retiring Boers were swiftly followed up by Thornycroft's column, however, and the gun was retaken, together with 20 of Kritzinger's men. It must be confessed that there seems some irony in the fact that the jury, within 5 days of the British ruling by which the Boers were no longer a military force, these non-belligerents had inflicted a loss of nearly 600 men killed, wounded, or taken. 2 small commandos, that of Coke in the Orange River Colony and that of Carolina, had been captured by Williams and Benson. Combined, they only numbered 109 men, but here, as always, they were men who could never be replaced. Those who had followed the war with care and had speculated upon the future were prepared on hearing of Botha's movement upon Natal to learn that de la Rey had also made some energetic attack in the western quarter of the Transvaal. Those who had formed this expectation were not disappointed, for upon the last day of September, the Boer chief struck fiercely at Kekowich's column in a vigorous night attack, which led to as stern an encounter as any in the campaign. This was the action at Moedwil near Magado Neck in the Magaliesburg. When last mentioned, de la Rey was in the Marico district near Zeerust, where he fought 2 actions with Methuen in the early part of September. Thence he made his way to Rustenburg and into the Magaliesburg country, where he joined Kemp. The Boer force was followed up by 2 British columns under Kekowich and Featherstonhall. The former commander had camped upon the night of Sunday, September 30th, at the farm of Moedwil in a strong position within a triangle formed by the Selous River on the west, a donga on the east, and the Zeerust-Rustenburg road as a base. The apex of the triangle pointed north, with a ridge on the farther side of the river. The men with Kekowich were for the most part the same as those who had fought in the Vlakfontein engagement, the Derbies, the 1st Scottish Horse, the Yeomanry, and the 28th RFA. Every precaution appears to have been taken by the leader, and his pickets were thrown out so far that ample warning was assured of an attack. The Boer onslaught came so suddenly and fiercely, however, in the early morning, that the posts upon the riverbank were driven in, or destroyed, and the riflemen from the ridge on the farther side were able to sweep the camp with their fire. In numbers the 2 forces were not unequal, but the Boers had already obtained the tactical advantage, and were playing a game in which they are the schoolmasters of the world. Never has the British spirit flamed up more fiercely, and from the commander to the latest yeoman recruit, there was not a man who flinched from a difficult and almost a desperate task. The Boers must at all hazard be driven from the position which enabled them to command the camp. No retreat was possible without such an abandonment of stores as would amount to a disaster. In the confusion and the uncertain light of early dawn, there was no chance of a concerted movement, though Kekowich made such dispositions as were possible with admirable coolness and promptness. Squadrons and companies closed in upon the river bank with the one thought of coming to close quarters and driving the enemy from their commanding position. Already more than half the horses and a very large number of officers and men had gone down before the pelting bullets. Scottish Horse, Yeomanry, and Derbies pushed on, the young soldiers of the 2 former corps keeping pace with the veteran regiment. "All the men behaved simply splendidly," said a spectator, taking what little cover there was and advancing yard by yard. An order was given to try and saddle up a squadron, with the idea of getting round their flank. I had the saddle almost on one of my ponies when he was hit in 2 places. 2 men trying to saddle alongside of me were both shot dead, and Lieutenant Wortley was shot through the knee. I ran back to where I had been firing from and found the colonel slightly hit, the adjutant wounded and dying, and men dead and wounded all round. But the counterattack soon began to make way. At first the advance was slow, but soon it quickened into a magnificent rush, the wounded Kekowich whooping on his men, and the guns coming into action as the enemy began to fall back before the fierce charge of the British riflemen. At 6 o'clock de la Rey's burghers had seen that their attempt was hopeless, and were in full retreat, a retreat which could not be harassed by the victors, whose cavalry had been converted by that hail of bullets into footmen. The repulse had been absolute and complete, for not a man or a cartridge had been taken from the British, but the price paid in killed and wounded was a heavy one. No fewer than 161 had been hit, including the gallant leader, whose hurt did not prevent him from resuming his duties within a few days. The heaviest losses fell upon the Scottish horse and upon the Derbies, but the yeomanry also proved on this, as on some other occasions, how ungenerous were the criticisms to which they had been exposed. There are few actions in the war which appear to have been more creditable to the troops engaged. Though repulsed at Moedwil de la Rey, the grim, long-bearded fighting man was by no means discouraged. From the earliest days of the campaign, when he first faced Methuen upon the road to Kimberley, he had shown that he was a most dangerous antagonist, tenacious, ingenious, and indomitable. With him were a body of irreconcilable burghers, who were the veterans of many engagements, and in Kemp he had an excellent fighting subordinate. His command extended over a wide stretch of populous country, and at any time he could bring considerable reinforcements to his aid, who would separate again to their farms and hiding places when their venture was accomplished. For some weeks after the fight at Moedwil, the Boer forces remained quiet in that district. 2 British columns had left Zeerust on October 17th, under Methuen and von Donop, in order to sweep the surrounding country, the one working in the direction of Ellen's River, and the other in that of Russenburg. They returned to Zeerust 12 days later, after a successful foray, which had been attended with much sniping and skirmishing, but only one action which is worthy of record. This was fought on October 24th at a spot near Kleinfontein upon the great Marico River, which runs to the northeast of Zeerust. Von Donop's column was straggling through very broken and bush-covered country when it was furiously charged in the flank and rear by 2 separate bodies of burghers. Kemp, who commanded the flank attack, cut into the line of wagons and destroyed 8 of them, killing many of the Kaffir drivers before he could be driven off. De la Rey's Steenkamp, who rushed the rear guard, had a more desperate contest. The Boer horsemen got among the 2 guns of the 4th RFA and held temporary possession of them, but the small escort were veterans of the Fighting Fifth, who lived up to the traditions of their famous North Country Regiment. Of the gun crews of the section, amounting to about 26 men, the young officer, Hill, and 16 men were hit. Of the escort of Northumberland Fusiliers, hardly a man was left standing, and 41 of the supporting yeomanry were killed and wounded. It was for some little time a fierce and concentrated struggle at the shortest of ranges. The British horsemen came galloping to the rescue, however, and the attack was finally driven back into that broken country from which it had come. 40 dead Boers upon the ground, with their brave chieftain, Wisterhuizen, amongst them, showed how manfully the attack had been driven home. The British losses were 28 killed and 56 wounded. Somewhat mauled, and with 8 missing wagons, the small column made its way back to Zeerust. From this incident until the end of the year, nothing of importance occurred in this part of the seat of war, save for a sharp and well-managed action at Beestekrel upon October 29, in which 79 Boers were surrounded and captured by Kekowich's horsemen. The process of attrition went very steadily forwards, and each of the British columns returned its constant tale of prisoners. The blockhouse system had now been extended to such an extent that the Magaliesburg was securely held, and a line had been pushed through from Klerksdorp and Frederiksstad to Ventersdorp. One of Colonel Hickey's yeomanry patrols was roughly handled near Braksbrut upon November 13th, but with this exception the points scored were all upon one side. Methuen and Kekowich came across early in November from Zeerust to Klerksdorp and operated from the railway line. The end of the year saw them both in the Wolmeranstad district, where they were gathering up prisoners and clearing the country. Of the events in the other parts of the Transvaal during the last 3 months of the year 1901, there is not much to be said. In all parts, the lines of blockhouses and of constabulary posts were neutralizing the Boer mobility and bringing them more and more within reach of the British. The only fighting forces left in the Transvaal were those under Botha in the southeast and those under De la Rey in the west. The others attempted nothing save to escape from their pursuers, and when overtaken they usually gave in without serious opposition. Among the larger hauls may be mentioned that of Dawkins in the Nilstrom district, 76 prisoners. Kakewich, 78. Collenbrander in the north, 57. Dawkins and Collenbrander, 104. Collenbrander, 62. But the great majority of the captures were in smaller bodies, gleaned from the caves, the kloofs, and the farmhouses. Only two small actions during these months appear to call for any separate notice. The first was an attack made by Buy's commando upon November 20th on the railway pioneers when at work near Villiersdorp in the extreme northeast of the Orange River colony. This corps, consisting mainly of miners from Johannesburg, had done invaluable service during the war. On this occasion, a working party of them was suddenly attacked, and most of them taken prisoners. Major Fisher, who commanded the pioneers, was killed, and 3 other officers with several men were wounded. Colonel Remington's column appeared upon the scene, however, and drove off the Boers, who left their leader Buys, a wounded prisoner in our hands. The second action was a sharp attack delivered by Muller's Boers upon Colonel Park's column on the night of December 19th at Ellensproot. The fight was sharp while it lasted, but it ended in the repulse of the assailants. The British casualties were 6 killed and 24 wounded. The Boers, who left 8 dead behind them, suffered probably to about the same extent. Already, the most striking and pleasing feature in the Transvaal was the tranquility of its central provinces, and the way in which the population was settling down to its old avocation. Pretoria had resumed its normal quiet life, while its larger and more energetic neighbor was rapidly recovering from its 2 years of paralysis. Every week more stamps were dropped in the mines, and from month to month a steady increase in the output showed that the great staple industry of the place would soon be as vigorous as ever. Most pleasing of all was the restoration of safety upon the railway lines, which, save for some precautions at night, had resumed their normal traffic. When the observer took his eyes from the dark clouds which shadowed every horizon, he could not but rejoice at the ever-widening central stretch of peaceful blue, which told that the storm was nearing its end. Having now dealt with the campaign in the Transvaal down to the end of 1901, it only remains to bring the chronicle of the events in the Orange River colony down to the same date. Reference has already been made to 2 small British reverses which occurred in September, the loss of 2 guns to the south of the waterworks near Bloemfontein, and the surprise of the camp of Lord Love's scouts. There were some indications at this time that a movement had been planned through the passes of the Drakensberg by a small Free State force, which should aid Louis Botha's invasion of Natal. The main movement was checked, however, and the demonstration in aid of it came to nothing. The blockhouse system had been developed to a very complete extent in the Orange River colony, and the small bands of Boers found it increasingly difficult to escape from the British columns who were forever at their heels. The southern portion of the country had been cut off from the northern by a line which extended through Bloemfontein on the east to the Basuto frontier, and on the west to Jacobsdal. To the south of this line, the Boer resistance had practically ceased, although several columns moved continually through it and gleaned up the broken fragments of the commandos. The northwest had also settled down to a large extent, and during the last 3 months of 1901, no action of importance occurred in that region. Even in the turbulent northeast, which had always been the center of resistance, there was little opposition to the British columns, which continued every week to send in their tale of prisoners. Of the column commanders, Williams, Demant, Dumoulin, Laurie Cole, and Wilson were the most successful. In their operations they were much aided by the South African constabulary. One young officer of this force, Major Pack Beresford, especially distinguished himself by his gallantry and ability. His premature death from enteric was a grave loss to the British Army. Save for one skirmish of Colonel Wilson's early in October, and another of Byng's on November 14th, there can hardly be said to have been any actual fighting until the events late in December, which I am about to describe. In the meanwhile, the peaceful organization of the country was being pushed forward as rapidly as in the Transvaal, although here the problems presented were of a different order, and the population an exclusively Dutch one. The schools already showed a higher attendance than in the days before the war, while a continual stream of burghers presented themselves to take the oath of allegiance, and even to join the ranks against their own irreconcilable countrymen, whom they looked upon with justice as the real authors of their troubles. Towards the end of November, there were signs that the word had gone forth for a fresh concentration of the fighting Boers in their old haunts in the Heilbronn district, and early in December, it was known that the indefatigable De Wet was again in the field. He had remained quiet so long that there had been persistent rumors of his injury and even of his death, but he was soon to show that he was as alive as ever. President Steyn was ill of a most serious complaint, caused possibly by the mental and physical sufferings which he had undergone, but with an indomitable resolution which makes one forget and forgive the fatuous policy which brought him and his state to such a pass. He still appeared in his Cape cart at the laager of the faithful remnant of his commandos. To those who remembered how widespread was our conviction of the half-heartedness of the Free Staters at the outbreak of the war, it was indeed a revelation to see them after 2 years still making a stand against the forces which had crushed them. It had been long evident that the present British tactics of scouring the country and capturing the isolated burghers must in time bring the war to a conclusion. From the Boer point of view, the only hope, or at least the only glory, lay in reassembling once more in larger bodies and trying conclusions with some of the British column. It was with this purpose that De Wet early in December assembled Wessels, Manie Botha, and others of his lieutenants, together with a force of about 2,000 men in the Heilbronn district. Small as this force was, it was admirably mobile, and every man in it was a veteran, toughened and seasoned by 2 years of constant fighting. De Wet's first operations were directed against an isolated column of Colonel Wilson's, which was surrounded within 20 miles of Heilbronn. Remington, in response to a heliographic call for assistance, hurried with admirable promptitude to the scene of action and joined hands with Wilson. De Wet's men were as numerous, however, as the two columns combined, and they harassed the return march into Heilbronn. A determined attack was made on the convoy and on the rear guard, but it was beaten off. That night Remington's camp was fired into by a large body of Boers, but he had cleverly moved his men away from the fires, so that no harm was done. The losses in these operations were small, but with troops which had not been trained in this method of fighting the situation would have been a serious one. For a fortnight or more after this, the burghers contented themselves by skirmishing with British columns and avoiding a drive which Elliott's forces made against them. On December 18th they took the offensive, however, and within a week fought 3 actions, 2 of which ended in their favor. News had come to British headquarters that Kaffir's Kop, to the northwest of Bethlehem, was a center of Boer activity. 3 columns were therefore turned in that direction: Elliott's, Barker's, and Dartnell's. Some desultory skirmishing ensued, which was only remarkable for the death of Hasbrouck, a well-known Boer leader. As the columns separated again, unable to find an objective, De Wet suddenly showed one of them that their failure was not due to his absence. Dartnell had retraced his steps nearly as far as Eland's River Bridge, when the Boer leader sprang out of his lair in the Lijnberg and threw himself upon him. The burghers attempted to ride in, as they had successfully done at Brakenlaagte, but they were opposed by the steady old troopers of the 2 regiments of Imperial Horse, and by a general who was familiar with every Boer ruse. The horsemen never got nearer than 150 yards to the British line, and were beaten back by the steady fire which met. Finding that he made no headway, and learning that Campbell's column was coming up from Bethlehem, De Wet withdrew his men after 4 hours' fighting. 15 were hit upon the British side, and the Boer loss seems to have been certainly as great or greater. De Wet's general aim in his operations seems to have been to check the British blockhouse building. With his main force in the Langberg, he could threaten the line which was now being erected between Bethlehem and Harrismith, a line against which his main commando was destined, only 2 months later, to beat itself in vain. 60 miles to the north, a second line was being run across country from Frankfurt to Standerton, and had reached a place called Tafelkop. A covering party of East Lancashires and yeomanry watched over the workers. But De Wet had left a portion of his force in that neighborhood, and they harassed the blockhouse builders to such an extent that General Hamilton, who was in command, found it necessary to send in to Frankfurt for support. The British columns there had just returned exhausted from a drive, but 3 bodies under Demant, Remington, and Wilson were at once dispatched to clear away the enemy. The weather was so atrocious that the veld resembled an inland sea, with the Kopjes as islands rising out of it. By this stage of the war, the troops were hardened to all weathers, and they pushed swiftly on to the scene of action. As they approached the spot where the Boers had been reported, the line had been extended over many miles, with the result that it had become very attenuated and dangerously weak in the center. At this point, Colonel Demant and his small staff were alone with the 2 guns and the Maxim, save for a handful of Imperial yeomanry, 91st, who acted as escort to the guns. Across the face of this small force there rode a body of men in khaki uniforms, keeping British formation and actually firing bogus volleys from time to time in the direction of some distant Boers. Demant and his staff seemed to have taken it for granted that these were Remington's men, and the clever ruse succeeded to perfection. Nearer and nearer came the strangers, and suddenly, throwing off all disguise, they made a dash for the guns. 4 rounds of case failed to stop them, and in a few minutes they were over the kopje on which the guns stood, and had ridden among the gunners, supported in their attack by a flank fire from a number of dismounted riflemen. The instant that the danger was realized, Demant, his staff, and the 40 yeomen who formed the escort dashed for the crest in the hope of anticipating the Boers. So rapid was the charge of the others that they had overwhelmed the gunners before the supports could reach the hill, and the latter found themselves under the deadly fire of the Boer rifles from above. Demant was hit in 4 places, all of his staff were wounded, and hardly a man of the small body of yeomanry was left standing. Nothing could exceed their gallantry. Gaussen, their captain, fell at their head. On the ridge, the men about the guns were nearly all killed or wounded. Of the gun detachment, only 2 men remained, both of them hit, and Jeffcoat, their dying captain, bequeathed them £50 each in a will drawn upon the spot. In half an hour, the center of the British line had been absolutely annihilated. Modern warfare is on the whole much less bloody than of old, but when one party has gained the tactical mastery, it is a choice between speedy surrender and total destruction. The widespread British wings had begun to understand that there was something amiss, and to ride in towards the center. An officer on the far right, peering through his glasses, saw those telltale puffs at the very muzzles of the British guns, which showed that they were firing case at close quarters. He turned his squadron inwards, and soon gathered up Scott's squadron of Demant's horse, and both rode for the kopje. Remington's men were appearing on the other side, and the Boers rode off. They were unable to remove the guns which they had taken, because all the horses had perished. "I actually thought," says one officer who saw them right away, "that I had made a mistake and been fighting our own men. They were dressed in our uniforms, and some of them wore the tiger skin, the badge of Demant's horse, round their hats." The same officer gives an account of the scene on the gun kopje. "The result when we got to the guns was this. Gunners all killed except 2, both wounded. Palm officers and men all killed. Maxim all killed. 91st, the gun escort. 1 officer and 1 man not hit. All the rest killed or wounded. Staff. Every officer hit. That is what it means to those who are caught in the vortex of the cyclone. The total loss was about 75. In this action, the Boers, who were under the command of Wessels, delivered their attack with a cleverness and dash which deserved success. Their stratagem, however, depending as it did upon the use of British uniforms and methods, was illegitimate by all the laws of war, and one can but marvel at the long, suffering patience of officers and men who endured such things without any attempt at retaliation. There's too much reason to believe also that considerable brutality was shown by those Boers who carried the kopje, and the very high proportion of killed to wounded among the British who lay there corroborates the statement of the survivors that several were shot at close quarters after all resistance had ceased. This rough encounter of Tafelkop was followed only 4 days later by a very much more serious one at Tweefontein, which proved that even after 2 years of experience we had not yet sufficiently understood the courage and the cunning of our antagonist. The blockhouse line was being gradually extended from Harrismith to Bethlehem, so as to hold down this turbulent portion of the country. The Harrismith section had been pushed as far as Tweefontein, which is 9 miles west of Ellen's River Bridge, and here a small force was stationed to cover the workers. This column consisted of 4 squadrons of the 4th Imperial Yeomanry, 1 gun of the 79th Battery, and 1 pom-pom, the whole under the temporary command of Major Williams of the South, Colonel Furman being absent. Knowing that De Wet and his men were in the neighborhood, the camp of the yeomen had been pitched in a position which seemed to secure it against attack. A solitary kopje presented a long slope to the north, while the southern end was precipitous. The outposts were pushed well out upon the plain, and a line of sentries was placed along the crest. The only precaution which seems to have been neglected was to have other outposts at the base of the southern declivity. It appears to have been taken for granted, however, that no attack was to be apprehended from that side, and that in any case it would be impossible to evade the vigilance of the sentries upon the top. Of all the daring and skillful attacks delivered by the Boers during the war, there is certainly none more remarkable than this one. At 2 o'clock in the morning of a moonlight night, De Wet's forlorn hope assembled at the base of the hill and clambered up to the summit. The fact that it was Christmas Eve may conceivably have had something to do with the want of vigilance upon the part of the sentries. In a season of goodwill and conviviality, the rigor of military discipline may insensibly relax. Little did the sleeping yeomen in the tents, or the drowsy outposts upon the crest, think of the terrible Christmas visitors who were creeping onto them, or of the grim morning gift which Santa Claus was bearing. The Boers, stealing up in their stockinged feet, poured under the crest until they were numerous enough to make a rush. It is almost inconceivable how they could have got so far without their presence being suspected by the sentries, but so it was. At last, feeling strong enough to advance, they sprang over the crest and fired into the pickets and passed them into the sleeping camp. The top of the hill being once gained, there was nothing to prevent their comrades from swarming up, and in a very few minutes nearly 1,000 Boers were in a position to command the camp. The British were not only completely outnumbered, but were hurried from their sleep into the fight without any clear idea as to the danger or how to meet it, while the hissing sleet of bullets struck many of them down as they rushed out of their tents. Considering how terrible the ordeal was to which they were exposed, these untried yeomen seem to have behaved very well. Some brave gentlemen ran away at the first shot, but I am thankful to say they were not many, says one of their number. The most veteran troops would have been tried very high had they been placed in such a position. The noise and the clamor, says one spectator, were awful. The yells of the Dutch, the screams and shrieks of dying men and horses, the cries of natives, howls of dogs, the firing, the galloping of horses, the whistling of bullets, and the whir volleys make in the air, made up such a compound of awful and diabolical sounds as I never heard before, nor hope to hear again. In the confusion, some of the men killed each other, and some killed themselves. 2 Boers who put on helmets were killed by their own people. The men were given no time to rally or to collect their thoughts, for the gallant Boers barged right into them, shooting them down, and occasionally being shot down, at a range of a few yards. Harwich and Wandy, who had charge of the Maxim, died nobly with all the men of their gun section round them. Reed, the sergeant major, rushed at the enemy with his clubbed rifle, but was riddled with bullets. Major Williams, the commander, was shot through the stomach as he rallied his men. The gunners had time to fire 2 rounds before they were overpowered and shot down to a man. For half an hour the resistance was maintained, but at the end of that time the Boers had the whole camp in their possession, and were already hastening to get their prisoners away before the morning should bring a rescue. The casualties are in themselves enough to show how creditable was the resistance of the yeomanry. Out of a force of under 400 men, they had 6 officers and 51 men killed, 8 officers and 80 men wounded. There have been very few surrenders during the war in which there has been such evidence as this of a determined stand. Nor was it a bloodless victory upon the part of the Boers, for there was evidence that their losses, though less than those of the British, were still severe. The prisoners, over 200 in number, were hurried away by the Boers, who seemed under the immediate eye of De Wet to have behaved with exemplary humanity to the wounded. The captives were taken by forced marches to the Basuto border, where they were turned adrift, half-clad, and without food. By devious ways and after many adventures, they all made their way back again to the British line. It was well for De Wet that he had shown such promptness in getting away, for within 3 hours of the end of the action, the 2 regiments of Imperial Horse appeared upon the scene, having traveled 17 miles in the time. Already, however, the rear guard of the Boers was disappearing into the fastness of the Langberg, where all pursuit was vain. Such was the short but vigorous campaign of De Wet in the last part of December of the year 1901. It had been a brilliant one, but nonetheless his bolt was shot, and Tweefontein was the last encounter in which British troops should feel his heavy hand. His operations, bold as they had been, had not delayed by a day the building of that iron cage which was gradually enclosing him. Already it was nearly completed, and in a few more weeks he was destined to find himself and his commando struggling against bars. Chapter 37. The Campaign of January to April, 1902. At the opening of the year 1902, it was evident to every observer that the Boer resistance, spirited as it was, must be nearing its close. By a long succession of captures, their forces were much reduced in numbers. They were isolated from the world, and had no means save precarious smuggling of renewing their supplies of ammunition. It was known also that their mobility, which had been their great strength, was decreasing, and that in spite of their admirable horse mastership, their supply of remounts was becoming exhausted. An increasing number of the burghers were volunteering for service against their own people, and it was found that all fears as to this delicate experiment were misplaced, and that in the whole army there were no keener and more loyal soldiers. The chief factor, however, in bringing the Boers to their knees was the elaborate and wonderful blockhouse system which had been strung across the whole of the enemy's country. The original blockhouses had been far apart, and were a hindrance and an annoyance rather than an absolute barrier to the burghers. The new models, however, were only 600 yards apart, and were connected by such impenetrable strands of wire that a Boer pithily described it by saying that if one's hat blew over the line anywhere between Ermelo and Standerton, one had to walk round Ermelo to fetch it. Use was made of such barriers by the Spaniards in Cuba, but an application of them on such a scale, over such an enormous tract of country, is one of the curiosities of warfare, and will remain one of several novelties which will make the South African campaign forever interesting to students of military history. The spines of this great system were always the railway lines, which were guarded on either side, and down which, as down a road, went flocks, herds, pedestrians, and everything which wished to travel in safety. From these long central cords, the lines branched out to right and left, cutting up the great country into manageable districts. A category of them would but weary the reader. But suffice it that by the beginning of the year the south, east of the Transvaal, and the north, east of the Orange River colony, the haunts of Botha and De Wet, had been so intersected that it was obvious that the situation must soon be impossible for both of them. Only on the west of the Transvaal was there a clear run for De la Rey and Kemp. Hence it was expected, as actually occurred, that in this quarter the most stirring events of the close of the campaign would happen. General Bruce Hamilton in the eastern Transvaal had continued the energetic tactics which had given such good results in the past. With the new year, his number of prisoners fell, but he had taken so many, and had hustled the remainder to such an extent, that the fight seemed to have gone out of the Boers in this district. On January 1st, he presented the first fruits of the year in the shape of 22 of Grobler's burgers. On the 3rd, he captured 49, while Wing, cooperating with him, took 20 more. Among these was General Erasmus, who had helped, or failed to help, General Lucas Meyer at Talana Hill. On the 10th, Colonel Wing's column, which was part of Hamilton's force, struck out again and took 42 prisoners, including the 2 Wolmoran. Only 2 days later, Hamilton returned to the same spot, and was rewarded with 32 more captures. On the 18th, he took 27. On the 24th, 12. And on the 26th, no fewer than 90. So severe were these blows, and so difficult was it for the Boers to know how to get away from an antagonist who was ready to ride 30 miles in a night in order to fall upon their laager, that the enemy became much scattered and too demoralized for offensive operations. Finding that they had grown too shy in this much shot over district, Hamilton moved farther south, and early in March took a cast round the Vryheid district, where he made some captures, notably General Cherry Emmett, a descendant of the famous Irish rebel, and brother-in-law of Louis Botha. For all these repeated successes, it was to the intelligence department, so admirably controlled by Colonel Woolsampson, that thanks are mainly due. Whilst Bruce Hamilton was operating so successfully in the Ermelo district, several British columns under Plumer, Spence, and Colville were stationed some 50 miles south to prevent the fugitives from getting away into the mountainous country which lies to the north of Wakkerstroom. On January 3rd, a small force of Plumer's New Zealanders had a brisk skirmish with a party of Boers, whose cattle they captured, though at some loss to themselves. These Boers were strongly reinforced, however, and when on the following day Major Valentin pursued them with 50 men, he found himself at Onverwacht, in the presence of several hundred of the enemy, led by Opperman and Christian Botha. Valentin was killed, and almost all of his small force were hit before British reinforcements, under Colonel Pulteney, drove the Boers off. 19 killed and 23 wounded were our losses in this most sanguinary little skirmish. 9 dead Boers, with Opperman himself, were left upon the field of battle. His loss was a serious one to the enemy, as he was one of their most experienced generals. From that time until the end, these columns, together with Mackenzie's column to the north of Ermelo, continued to break up all combinations, and to send in their share of prisoners to swell Lord Kitchener's weekly list. A final drive organized on April 11th against the Standerton line resulted in 134 prisoners. In spite of the very large army in South Africa, so many men were absorbed by the huge lines of communications and the blockhouse system that the number available for active operations was never more than 40 or 50,000 men. With another 50,000, there is no doubt that at least 6 months would have been taken from the duration of the war. On account of this short-handedness, Lord Kitchener had to leave certain districts alone, while he directed his attention to those which were more essential. Thus, to the north of the Delagoa railway line, there was only one town, Lydenburg, which was occupied by the British. They had, however, an energetic commander in Park of the Devons. This leader, striking out from his stronghold among the mountains, and aided by Urmston from Belfast, kept the commando of Benviljoen and the peripatetic government of Schockburger continually upon the move. As already narrated, Park fought a sharp night action upon December 19th, after which, in combination with Urmston, he occupied Dullstroom, only missing the government by a few hours. In January, Park and Ermston were again upon the warpath, though the incessant winds, fogs, and rains of that most inclement portion of the Transvaal seriously hampered their operation. Several skirmishes with the commandos of Muller and Trichart gave no very decisive result. But a piece of luck befell the British on January 25th in the capture of General Viljoen by an ambuscade cleverly arranged by Major Orr in the neighborhood of Leidenburg. Though a great firebrand before the war, Viljoen had fought bravely and honorably throughout the contest, and he had won the respect and esteem of his enemy. Colonel Park had had no great success in his last two expeditions, but on February 20th he made an admirable march and fell upon a Boer laager, which lay in placid security in the heart of the hills. 164 prisoners, including many Boer officers, were the fruits of this success, in which the National Scouts, or Tame Boers, as they were familiarly called, played a prominent part. This commando was that of Middelburg, which was acting as escort to the government, who again escaped dissolution. Early in March, Park was again out on trek, upon one occasion covering 70 miles in a single day. Nothing further of importance came from this portion of the seat of war until March 23rd, when the news reached England that Schockburger, Reitz, Lucas Meyer, and others of the Transvaal government had come into Middelburg, and that they were anxious to proceed to Pretoria to treat. On the eastern horizon had appeared the first golden gleam of the dawning peace. Having indicated the course of events in the eastern Transvaal, north and south of the railway line, I will now treat one or two incidents which occurred in the more central and northern portions of the country. I will then give some account of De Wet's doings in the Orange River colony, and finally describe that brilliant effort of De la Rey's in the west, which shed a last glory upon the Boer arm. In the latter days of December, Collenbrander and Dawkins, operating together, had put in a great deal of useful work in the northern district, and from Millstrom to Pietersburg, the burghers were continually harried by the activity of these leaders. Late in the month, Dawkins was sent down into the Orange River colony in order to reinforce the troops who were opposed to De Wet. Collenbrander alone, with his hardy colonial forces, swept through the Magaliesberg, and had the double satisfaction of capturing a number of the enemy, and of heading off and sending back a war party of Lynchwy's Kaffirs, incensed by a cattle raid of Kemps, were moving down in a direction which would have brought them dangerously near to the Dutch women and children. This instance, and several similar ones in the campaign, show how vile are the lies which have been told of the use, save under certain well-defined conditions, of armed natives by the British during the war. It would have been a perfectly easy thing at any time for the government to have raised all the fighting native races of South Africa. But it is not probable that we, who held back our admirable and highly disciplined Sikhs and Gorkhas, would break our self-imposed restrictions in order to enroll the inferior but more savage races of Africa. Yet no charge has been more often repeated and has caused more piteous protests among the soft-hearted and soft-headed editors of continental journals. The absence of Collenbrander in the Rustenburg country gave Beyers a chance of which he was not slow to avail himself. On January 24th, in the early morning, he delivered an attack upon Pietersburg itself, but he was easily driven off by the small garrison. It is probable, however, that the attack was a mere feint in order to enable a number of the inmates of the refugee camp to escape. About 150 made off and rejoined the commandos. There were 3,000 Boers in all in this camp, which was shortly afterwards moved down to Natal in order to avoid the recurrence of such an incident. Collenbrander, having returned to Pietersburg once more, determined to return Beyers's visit, and upon April 8th, he moved out with a small force to surprise the Boer laager. The Inniskilling Fusiliers seized the ground which commanded the enemy's position. The latter retreated but were followed up, and altogether about 150 were killed, wounded. On May 3rd, a fresh operation against Beyers was undertaken, and resulted in about the same loss to the Boers. On the other hand, the Boers had a small success against Kitchener's scouts, killing 18 and taking 30 prisoners. There is one incident, however, in connection with the war in this region which one would desire to pass over in silence if such a course were permissible. Some 80 miles to the east of Pietersburg is a wild part of the country called the Spelunken. In this region, an irregular corps, named the Bushveld Carbineers, had been operating. It was raised in South Africa, but contained both colonials and British in its ranks. Its wild duties, its mixed composition, and its isolated situation must have all militated against discipline and restraint, and it appears to have degenerated into a band not unlike those Southern bush whackers in the American War to whom the Federals showed little mercy. They had given short shrift to the Boer prisoners who had fallen into their hands, the excuse offered for their barbarous conduct being that an officer who had served in the corps had himself been murdered by the Boers. Such a reason, even if it were true, could of course offer no justification for indiscriminate revenge. The crimes were committed in July and August 1901, but it was not until January 1902 that 5 of the officers were put upon their trial and were found to be guilty as principals or accessories of 12 murders. The corps was disbanded, and 3 of the accused officers, Hancock, Wilton, and Morant, were sentenced to death, while another, Picton, was cashiered. Hancock and Morant were actually executed. This stern measure shows more clearly than volumes of argument could do how high was the standard of discipline in the British Army, and how heavy was the punishment, and how vain all excuses where it had been infringed. In the face of this actual outrage and its prompt punishment, how absurd becomes that crusade against imaginary outrages preached by an ignorant press abroad and by renegade Englishmen at home. To the south of Johannesburg, halfway between that town and the frontier, there is a range of hills called the Zuikerboschrand, which extends across from one railway system to the other. A number of Boers were known to have sought refuge in this country, so upon February 12th, a small British force left Klip River Post in order to clear them out. There were 320 men in all, composing the 28th Mounted Infantry, drawn from the Lancashire Fusiliers, Warwicks, and Derbies, most of whom had just arrived from Malta, which one would certainly imagine to be the last place where mounted infantry could be effectively trained. Major Doyle was in command. An advance was made into the hilly country, but it was found that the enemy was in much greater force than had been imagined. The familiar Boer tactics were used with the customary success. The British line was held by a sharp fire in front, while strong flanking parties galloped round each of the wings. It was with great difficulty that any of the British extricated themselves from their perilous position, and the safety of a portion of the force was only secured by the devotion of a handful of officers and men, who gave their lives in order to gain time for their comrades to get away. 12 killed and 50 wounded were our losses in this unfortunate skirmish, and about 100 prisoners supplied the victors with a useful addition to their rifles and ammunition. A stronger British force came up next day, and the enemy were driven out of the hills. A week later, upon February 18th, there occurred another skirmish at Klippen, near Springs, between a squadron of the Scots Greys and a party of Boers who had broken into this central reserve, which Lord Kitchener had long kept clear of the enemy. In this action, the cavalry were treated as roughly as the mounted infantry had been the week before, losing 3 officers killed, 8 men killed or wounded, and 46 taken. They had formed a flanking party to General Gilbert Hamilton's column, but were attacked and overwhelmed so rapidly that the blow had fallen before their comrades could come to their assistance. One of the consequences of the successful drives about to be described in the Orange River colony was that a number of the Free Staters came north of the Vaal in order to get away from the extreme pressure upon the south. At the end of March, a considerable number had reinforced the local commandos in that district to the east of Springs, no very great distance from Johannesburg, which had always been a storm center. A cavalry force was stationed at this spot, which consisted at that time of the 2nd Queen's Bays, the 7th Hussars, and some National Scouts, all under Colonel Lawley of the Hussars. After a series of minor engagements east of Springs, Lawley had possessed himself of Boschman's Cop, 18 miles from that town, close to the district which was the chief scene of Boer activity. From this base, he dispatched upon the morning of April 1st 3 squadrons of the Bays under Colonel Fanshawe, for the purpose of surprising a small force of the enemy which was reported at one of the farms. Fanshawe's strength was about 300 men. The British cavalry found themselves, however, in the position of the hunter who, when he is out for a snipe, puts up a tiger. All went well with the expedition as far as Holsprut, the farm which they had started to search. Commandant Pretorius, to whom it belonged, was taken by the energy of Major Vaughan, who pursued and overtook his Cape cart. It was found, however, that Alberts's commando was camped at the farm, and that the Bays were in the presence of a very superior force of the enemy. The night was dark, and when firing began, it was almost muzzle to muzzle, with the greatest possible difficulty in telling friend from foe. The 3 squadrons fell back upon some rising ground, keeping admirable order under most difficult circumstances. In spite of the darkness, the attack was pressed fiercely home, and with their favorite tactics the burghers rapidly outflanked the position taken up by the cavalry. The British moved by alternate squadrons onto a higher rocky kopje on the east, which could be vaguely distinguished, looming in the darkness against the sky. B Squadron, the last to retire, was actually charged and ridden through by the brave assailants, firing from their saddles as they broke through the ranks. The British had hardly time to reach the kopje and to dismount and line its edge when the Boers, yelling loudly, charged with their horses up the steep flanks. Twice they were beaten back, but the third time they seized one corner of the hill and opened a hot fire upon the rear of the line of men who were defending the other side. Dawn was now breaking and the situation most serious, for the Boers were in very superior numbers and were pushing their pursuit with the utmost vigor and determination. A small party of officers and men whose horses had been shot covered the retreat of their comrades, and continued to fire until all of them, 2 officers and 23 men, were killed or wounded, the whole of their desperate defense being conducted within from 30 to 50 yards of the enemy. The remainder of the regiment was now retired to successive ridges, each of which was rapidly outflanked by the Boers, whose whole method of conducting their attack was extraordinarily skillful. Nothing but the excellent discipline of the overmatched troopers prevented the retreat from becoming a rout. Fortunately, before the pressure became intolerable, the 7th Hussars with some artillery came to the rescue and turned the tide. The Hussars galloped in with such dash that some of them actually got among the Boers with their swords, but the enemy rapidly fell back and disappeared. In this very sharp and sanguinary cavalry skirmish, the Bays lost 80 killed and wounded out of a total force of 270. To stand such losses under such circumstances and to preserve absolute discipline and order is a fine test of soldierly virtue. The adjutant, the squadron leaders, and 6 out of 10 officers were killed or wounded. The Boers lost equally heavily. 2 Prinsloo's, one of them a commandant, and 3 field cornets were among the slain, with 70 other casualties. The force under General Alberts was a considerable one, not fewer than 600 rifles, so that the action at Holsprut is one which adds another name of honor to the battle roll of the Bays. It is pleasing to add that in this and the other actions which were fought at the end of the war, our wounded met with kindness and consideration from the enemy. We may now descend to the Orange River colony and trace the course of those operations which were destined to break the power of De Wet's command. On these we may concentrate our attention, for the marchings and gleanings and snipings of the numerous small columns in the other portions of the colony, although they involved much arduous and useful work, do not claim a particular account. After the heavy blow which he dealt Furman's yeomanry, De Wet retired, as has been told, into the Lijnberg, whence he afterwards retreated towards Reitz. There he was energetically pushed by Elliott's columns, which had attained such mobility that 150 miles were performed in 3 days within a single week. Our rough schoolmasters had taught us our lesson, and the soldiering which accomplished the marches of Bruce, Hamilton, Elliot, Remington, and the other leaders of the end of the war was very far removed from that which is associated with ox wagons and harmoniums. Moving rapidly and covering himself by a succession of rearguard skirmishes, De Wet danced like a will-o'-the-wisp in front of and round the British columns. Delisle, Fanshawe, Byng, Remington, Dawkins, and Rawlinson were all snatching at him and finding him just beyond their fingertips. The mastermind at Pretoria had, however, thought out a scheme which was worthy of De Wet himself in its ingenuity. A glance at the map will show that the little branch from Heilbronn to Wolfhoek forms an acute angle with the main line. Both these railways were strongly blockhoused and barbed wired, so that any force which was driven into the angle, and held in it by a force behind it, would be in a perilous position. To attempt to round De Wet's mobile burghers into this obvious pen would have been to show one's hand too clearly. In vain is the net laid in sight of the bird. The drive was therefore made away from this point, with the confident expectation that the guerrilla chief would break back through the columns, and that they might then pivot round upon him and hustle him so rapidly into the desired position that he would not realize his danger until it was too late. Byng's column was left behind the driving line to be ready for the expected backward break. All came off exactly as expected. De Wet doubled back through the columns, and one of his commandos stumbled upon Byng's men, who were waiting on the Vlaai River to the west of Wright's. The Boers seemed to have taken it for granted that, having passed the British driving line, they were out of danger, and for once it was they who were surprised. The South African Light Horse, the New Zealanders, and the Queensland Bushmen all rode in upon them. A 15-pounder, the one taken at Tweefontein, and 2 pom-poms were captured, with 30 prisoners and a considerable quantity of stores. This successful skirmish was a small matter, however, compared to the importance of being in close touch with De Wet and having a definite objective for the drive. The columns behind expanded suddenly into a spray of mounted men, forming a continuous line for over 60 miles. On February 5th, the line was advancing, and on the 6th it was known that De Wet was actually within the angle, the mouth of which was spanned by the British line. Hope ran high in Pretoria. The space into which the burgher chief had been driven was bounded by 66 miles of blockhouse and wire on one side, and 30 on the other, while the third side of the triangle was crossed by 55 miles of British horsemen, flanked by a blockhouse line between Kroonstad and Lindley. The tension along the lines of defense was extreme. Infantry guarded every yard of them, and armored trains patrolled them, while at night searchlights at regular intervals shed their vivid rays over the black expanse of the veld and illuminated the mounted figures who flitted from time to time across their narrow belts of light. On the 6th, De Wet realized his position, and with characteristic audacity and promptness, he took means to clear the formidable toils which had been woven round him. The greater part of his command scattered, with orders to make their way as best they might out of the danger. Working in their own country, where every crease and fold of the ground was familiar to them, it is not surprising that most of them managed to make their way through gaps in the attenuated line of horsemen behind them. A few were killed, and a considerable number taken, 270 being the respectable total of the prisoners. 3 or 4 slipped through, however, for everyone who stuck in the meshes. De Wet himself was reported to have made his escape by driving cattle against the wire fences which enclosed him. It seems, however, to have been nothing more romantic than a wire cutter which cleared his path, though cattle no doubt made their way through the gap which he left. With a loss of only 3 of his immediate followers, De Wet won his way out of the most dangerous position which even his adventurous career had ever known. Lord Kitchener had descended to Wolfhoek to be present at the climax of the operations, but it was not fated that he was to receive the submission of the most energetic of his opponents, and he returned to Pretoria to weave a fresh mesh around him. This was not hard to do, as the Boer general had simply escaped from one pen into another, though a larger one. After a short rest to restore the columns, the whole pack were full cry upon his heels once more. An acute angle is formed by the Wilge River on one side, and the line of blockhouses between Harrismith and Van Reenen upon the other. This was strongly manned by troops in 5 columns. Those of Rawlinson, Nixon, Byng, Remington, and Keir herded the broken commandos into the trap. From February 20th, the troops swept in an enormous skirmish line across the country, ascending hills, exploring kloofs, searching riverbanks, and always keeping the enemy in front of them. At last, when the pressure was severely felt, there came the usual breakback, which took the form of a most determined night attack upon the British line. This was delivered shortly after midnight on February 23rd. It struck the British cordon at the point of juncture between Byng's column and that of Remington. So huge were the distances which had to be covered, and so attenuated was the force which covered them, that the historical thin red line was a massive formation, compared to its khaki equivalent. The chain was frail, and the links were not all carefully joined, but each particular link was good metal, and the Boer impact came upon one of the best. This was the 7th New Zealand contingent, who proved themselves to be worthy comrades to their 6 gallant predecessors. Their patrols were broken by the rush of wild, yelling, firing horsemen, but the troopers made a most gallant resistance. Having pierced the line, the Boers, who were led in their fiery rush by Mani Botha, turned to their flank, and charging down the line of weak patrols, overwhelmed one after another, and threatened to roll up the whole line. They had cleared a gap of half a mile, and it seemed as if the whole Boer force would certainly escape through so long a gap in the defences. The desperate defence of the New Zealanders gave time, however, for the further patrols, which consisted of Cox's New South Wales mounted infantry, to fall back almost at right angles so as to present a fresh face to the attack. The pivot of the resistance was a Maxim gun, most gallantly handled by Captain Begbie and his men. The fight at this point was almost muzzle to muzzle. 50 or 60 New Zealanders and Australians, with the British gunners holding off a force of several hundred of the best fighting men of the Boer forces. In this desperate duel, many dropped on both sides. Begbie died beside his gun, which fired 80 rounds before it jammed. It was run back by its crew in order to save it from capture. But reinforcements were coming up, and the Boer attack was beaten back. A number of them had escaped, however, through the opening which they had cleared, and it was conjectured that the wonderful De Wet was among them. How fierce was the storm which had broken on the New Zealanders may be shown by their roll of 20 killed and 40 wounded, while 30 dead Boers were picked up in front of their picket line. Of 8 New Zealand officers, 7 are reported to have been hit, an even higher proportion than that which the same gallant race endured at the Battle of Renosterkop more than a year before. It was feared at first that the greater part of the Boers might have escaped upon this night of the 23rd, when Mani Botha's storming party burst through the ranks of the New Zealanders. It was soon discovered that this was not so, and the columns as they closed in had evidence from the numerous horsemen who scampered aimlessly over the hills in front of them that the main body of the enemy was still in the toils. The advance was in tempestuous weather and over rugged country, but the men were filled with eagerness, and no precaution was neglected to keep the line intact. This time their efforts were crowned with considerable success. A second attempt was made by the corralled burghers to break out on the night of February 26th, but it was easily repulsed by Nixon. The task of the troopers as the cordon drew south was more and more difficult, and there were places traversed upon the Nile border where an alpenstock would have been a more useful adjunct than a horse. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 27th came the end. 2 Boers appeared in front of the advancing line of the Imperial Light Horse and held up a flag. They proved to be Truter and De Jager, ready to make terms for their commando. The only terms offered were absolute surrender within the hour. The Boers had been swept into a very confined space, which was closely hemmed in by troops, so that any resistance must have ended in a tragedy. Fortunately, there was no reason for desperate counsels in their case, since they did not fight as Lauder had done, with the shadow of judgment hanging over him. The burghers piled arms, and all was over. The total number captured in this important drive was 780 men, including several leaders, one of whom was De Wet's own son. It was found that De Wet himself had been among those who had got away through the picket lines on the night of the 23rd. Most of the commando were Transvaalers, and it was typical of the wide sweep of the net that many of them were the men who had been engaged against the 28th Mounted Infantry in the districts south of Johannesburg upon the 12th of the same month. The loss of 2,000 horses and 50,000 cartridges meant as much as that of the men to the Boer army. It was evident that a few more such blows would clear the Orange River colony altogether. The wearied troopers were allowed little rest, for in a couple of days after their rendezvous at Harrismith, they were sweeping back again to pick up all that they had missed. This drive, which was over the same ground, but sweeping backwards towards the Heilbronn to Wulfhoek line, ended in the total capture of 147 of the enemy, who were picked out of holes, retrieved from amid the reeds of the river, called down out of trees, or otherwise collected. So thorough were the operations that it is recorded that the angle which formed the apex of the drive was one drove of game upon the last day. All the many types of antelope, which form one of the characteristics and charms of the country, having been herded into it. More important even than the results of the drive was the discovery of one of De Wet's arsenals in a cave in the Vrede district. Halfway down in a precipitous krantz, with its mouth covered by creepers, no writer of romance could have imagined a more fitting headquarters for a guerrilla chief. The find was made by Ross's Canadian scouts, who celebrated Dominion Day by this most useful achievement. 40 wagon loads of ammunition and supplies were taken out of the cave. De Wet was known to have left the northeast district and to have got across the railway, traveling towards the Vaal as if it were his intention to join de la Rey in the Transvaal. The Boer resistance had suddenly become exceedingly energetic in that part, and several important actions had been fought, to which we will presently turn. Before doing so, it would be as well to bring the chronicle of events in the Orange River colony down to the conclusion of peace. There were still a great number of wandering Boers in the northern districts and in the frontier mountains, who were assiduously, but not always successfully, hunted down by the British troops. Much arduous and useful work was done by several small columns, the colonial horse and the artillery, mounted rifles especially distinguishing themselves. The latter corps, formed from the gunners whose field pieces were no longer needed, proved themselves to be a most useful body of men. And the British gunner, when he took to carrying his gun, vindicated the reputation which he had won when his gun had carried him. From the 1st to the 4th of May, a successful drive was conducted by many columns in the often harried but never deserted Lindley to Kroonstad district. The result was propitious, as no fewer than 321 prisoners were brought in. Of these, 150 underments were captured in one body as they attempted to break through the encircling cordon. Amid many small drives and many skirmishes, one stands out for its severity. It is remarkable as being the last action of any importance in the campaign. This was the fight at Moulmansprout, near Vicksburg, upon April 20th, 1902. A force of about 100 yeomanry and 40 mounted infantry, South Staffords, was dispatched by night to attack an isolated farm in which a small body of Boers was supposed to be sleeping. Colonel Percival was in command. The farm was reached after a difficult march, but the enemy were found to have been forewarned, and to be in much greater strength than was anticipated. A furious fire was opened on the advancing troops, who were clearly visible in the light of a full moon. Sir Thomas Fowler was killed, and several men of the yeomanry were hit. The British charged up to the very walls, but were unable to effect an entrance, as the place was barricaded and loopholed. Captain Blackwood of the Staffords was killed in the attack. Finding that the place was impregnable, and that the enemy outnumbered him, Colonel Percival gave the order to retire, a movement which was only successfully carried out because the greater part of the Boer horses had been shot. By morning, the small British force had extricated itself from its perilous position with a total loss of 6 killed, 19 wounded, and 6 missing. The whole affair was undoubtedly a cleverly planned Boer ambush, and the small force was most fortunate in escaping destruction. One other isolated incident may be mentioned here, though it occurred far away in the Vryheid district of the Transvaal. This was the unfortunate encounter between Zulus and Boers, by which the latter lost over 50 of their numbers under deplorable circumstances. This portion of the Transvaal has only recently been annexed, and is inhabited by warlike Zulus, who are very different from the debased Kaffirs of the rest of the country. These men had a blood feud against the Boers, which was embittered by the fact that they had lost heavily through Boer depredations. Knowing that a party of 59 men were sleeping in a farmhouse, the Zulus crept onto it and slaughtered every man of the inmates. Such an incident is much to be regretted. And yet, looking back upon the long course of the war, and remembering the turbulent tribes who surrounded the combatants, Swazis, Basutos, and Zulus, we may well congratulate ourselves that we have been able to restrain those black warriors, and to escape the brutalities and the bitter memories of a barbarian invasion. Chapter 38. De la Rey's Campaign of 1902. It will be remembered that at the close of 1901, Lord Methuen and Colonel Kekewich had both come across to the eastern side of their district and made their base at the railway line in the Klerksdorp section. Their position was strengthened by the fact that a blockhouse cordon now ran from Klerksdorp to Ventersdorp, and from Ventersdorp to Potchefstroom, so that this triangle could be effectively controlled. There remained, however, a huge tract of difficult country, which was practically in the occupation of the enemy. Several thousand stalwarts were known to be riding with de la Rey and his energetic Lieutenant Kemp. The strenuous operations of the British in the eastern Transvaal and in the Orange River colony had caused this district to be comparatively neglected, and so everything was in favor of an aggressive movement of the Boers. There was a long lull after the unsuccessful attack upon Kekewich's camp at Moedwil, but close observers of the war distrusted this ominous calm and expected a storm to follow. The new year found the British connecting Ventersdorp with Tafelkop by a blockhouse line. The latter place had been a center of Boer activity. Colonel Hickey's column covered this operation. Meanwhile, Methuen had struck across through Wolmaranstad as far as Vryburg. In these operations, which resulted in constant small captures, he was assisted by a column under Major Paris, working from Kimberley. From Vryburg, Lord Methuen made his way in the middle of January to Lichtenberg, meeting with a small rebuff in the neighborhood of that town, for a detachment of yeomanry was overwhelmed by General Selliers, who killed 8, wounded 15, and captured 40. From Lichtenberg, Lord Methuen continued his enormous trek and arrived on February 1st at Klerksdorp once more. Little rest was given to his hard-worked troops, and they were sent off again within the week under the command of von Donop, with the result that on February 8th, near Wolmaranstad, they captured Potgieterslager with 40 Boer prisoners. Von Donop remained at Wolmaranstad until late in February. On the 23rd, he dispatched an empty convoy back to Klerksdorp, the fate of which will be afterwards narrated. Kekewich and Hickey had combined their forces at the beginning of February. On February 4th, an attempt was made by them to surprise General de la Rey. The mounted troops who were dispatched under Major Leader failed in this enterprise, but they found and overwhelmed the lager of Cyril Alberts, capturing 132 prisoners. By stampeding the horses, the Boer retreat was cut off, and the attack was so furiously driven home, especially by the admirable Scottish horse, that few of the enemy got away. Alberts himself, with all his officers, were among the prisoners. From this time until the end of February, this column was not seriously engaged. It has been stated above that on February 23rd, von Donop sent in an empty convoy from Wolmaranstad to Klerksdorp. a distance of about 50 miles. Nothing had been heard for some time of De la Rey, but he had called together his men and was waiting to bring off some coup. The convoy gave him the very opportunity for which he sought. The escort of the convoy consisted of the 5th Imperial Yeomanry, 60 of Paget's horse, 3 companies of the ubiquitous Northumberland Fusiliers, 2 guns of the 4th RFA, and a pom-pom, amounting in all to 630 men. Colonel Anderson was in command. On the morning of Tuesday, February 25th, the convoy was within 10 miles of its destination, and the sentries on the kopjes round the town could see the gleam of the long line of white-tilted wagons. Their hazardous voyage was nearly over, and yet they were destined to most complete and fatal wreck within sight of port. So confident were they that the detachment of Paget's horse was permitted to ride on the night before into the town. It was as well, for such a handful would have shared and could not have averted the disaster. The night had been dark and wet, and the Boers under cover of it had crept between the sleeping convoy and the town. Some bushes which afford excellent cover lie within a few hundred yards of the road, and here the main ambush was laid. In the first grey of the morning, the long line of the convoy, 130 wagons in all, came trailing past, guns and yeomanry in front, fusiliers upon the flanks and rear. Suddenly the black bank of scrub was outlined in flame, and a furious rifle fire was opened upon the head of the column. The troops behaved admirably under most difficult circumstances. A counter-attack by the fusiliers and some of the yeomanry, under cover of shrapnel from the guns, drove the enemy out of the scrub and silenced his fire at this point. It was evident, however, that he was present in force, for firing soon broke out along the whole left flank, and the rearguard found itself as warmly attacked as the van. Again, however, the assailants were driven off. It was now broad daylight, and the wagons, which had got into great confusion in the first turmoil battle, had been remarshalled and arranged. It was Colonel Anderson's hope that he might be able to send them on into safety while he with the escort covered their retreat. His plan was certainly the best one, and if it did not succeed, it was due to nothing which he could avert, but to the nature of the ground and the gallantry of the enemy. The physical obstacle consisted in a very deep and difficult spruit, the jagged spruit, which forms an ugly passage in times of peace, but which, when crowded and choked with stampeding mules and splintering wagons, under their terrified conductors, soon became impassable. Here the head of the column was clubbed, and the whole line came to a stand. Meanwhile, the enemy, adopting their new tactics, came galloping in on the left flank and on the rear. The first attack was repelled by the steady fire of the fusiliers, but on the second occasion the horsemen got up to the wagons, and galloping down them were able to overwhelm in detail the little knots of soldiers who were scattered along the flank. The British, who were outnumbered by at least 3 to 1, made a stout resistance, and it was not until 7 o'clock that the last shot was fired. The result was a complete success to the burghers, but one which leaves no shadow of discredit on any officer or man among those who were engaged. 11 officers and 176 men fell out of about 550 actually engaged. The 2 guns were taken. The convoy was no use to the Boers, so the teams were shot, and the wagons burned before they withdrew. The prisoners, too, they were unable to retain, and their sole permanent trophies consisted of the 2 guns, the rifles, and the ammunition. Their own losses amounted to about 50 killed and wounded. A small force sallied out from Klerksdorp in the hope of helping Anderson, but on reaching the Jag Drift it was found that the fighting was over, and that the field was in possession of the Boers. De la Rey was seen in person among the burghers, and it is pleasant to add that he made himself conspicuous by his humanity to the wounded. His force drew off in the course of the morning, and was soon out of reach of immediate pursuit, though this was attempted by Kekewich, von Donop, and Grenfell. It was important to regain the guns if possible, as they were always a menace to the blockhouse system, and for this purpose Grenfell with 1,600 horsemen was dispatched to a point south of Lichtenberg, which was conjectured to be upon the Boer line of retreat. At the same time, Lord Methuen was ordered up from Vryburg in order to cooperate in this movement, and to join his forces to those of Grenfell. It was obvious that with an energetic and resolute adversary like de la Rey, there was great danger of these two forces being taken in detail. But it was hoped that each was strong enough to hold its own until the other could come to its aid. The result was to show that the danger was real and the hope fallacious. It was on March 2nd that Methuen left Vryburg. The column was not his old one, consisting of veterans of the Trek, but was the Kimberley column under Major Paris, a body of men who had seen much less service and were in every way less reliable. It included a curious mixture of units, the most solid of which were 4 guns, 2 of the 4th, and 2 of the 38th RFA, 200 Northumberland Fusiliers, and 100 loyal North Lancashires. The mounted men included 5th Imperial Yeomanry, 184, Cape Police, 233, Cullinan's Horse, 64, 86th Imperial Yeomanry, 110, Diamond Field's Horse, 92, Denison's Scouts, 58, Ashburner's Horse, 126, and British South African Police, 24. Such a collection of samples would be more in place, one would imagine, in a London procession than in an operation which called for discipline and cohesion. In warfare, the half is often greater than the whole, and the presence of a proportion of half-hearted and inexperienced men may be a positive danger to their more capable companions. Upon March 6th, Methuen, marching east towards Lichtenberg, came in touch near Loosproot with Van Zil's commando, and learned in the small skirmish which ensued that some of his yeomanry were unreliable and ill-instructed. Having driven the enemy off by his artillery fire, Methuen moved to Tweebosch, where he loggered until next morning. At 3 a.m. of the 7th, the ox convoy was sent on, under escort of half of his little force. The other half followed at 4:20, so as to give the slow-moving oxen a chance of keeping ahead. It was evident, however, immediately after the column had got started that the enemy were all round in great numbers, and that an attack in force was to be expected. Lord Methuen gave orders, therefore, that the ox wagons should be halted, and that the mule transport should close upon them so as to form one solid block, instead of a straggling line. At the same time, he reinforced his rear guard with mounted men and with 2 guns, for it was in that quarter that the enemy appeared to be most numerous and aggressive. An attack was also developing upon the right flank, which was held off by the infantry and by the second section of the gun. It has been said that Methuen's horsemen were for the most part inexperienced irregulars. Such men become in time excellent soldiers, as all this campaign bears witness, but it is too much to expose them to a severe ordeal in the open field when they are still raw and untrained. As it happened, this particular ordeal was exceedingly severe, but nothing can excuse the absolute failure of the troops concerned to rise to the occasion. Had Methuen's rear guard consisted of Imperial Light Horse or Scottish Horse, it is safe to say that the Battle of Tweebosch would have had a very different ending. What happened was that a large body of Boers formed up in 5 lines and charged straight home at the rear screen and rear guard, firing from their saddles as they had done at Brakenleck. The sight of those wide-flung lines of determined men galloping over the plain seems to have been too much for the nerves of the unseasoned troopers. A panic spread through their ranks, and in an instant they had turned their horses' heads and were thundering to their rear, leaving the 2 guns uncovered and streaming in wild confusion past the left flank of the jeering infantry who were lying round the wagons. The limit of their flight seems to have been the wind of their horses, and most of them never drew rein until they had placed many miles between themselves and the comrades whom they had deserted. It was pitiable, says an eyewitness, to see the grand old general begging them to stop, but they would not. A large body of them arrived in Krypan without firing a shot. It was a South African battle of the spur. By this defection of the greater portion of the force, the handful of brave men who remained were left in a hopeless position. The 2 guns of the 38th Battery were overwhelmed and ridden over by the Boer horsemen, every man being killed or wounded, including Lieutenant Nesham, who acted up to the highest traditions of his corps. The battle, however, was not yet over. The infantry were few in number, but they were experienced troops, and they maintained the struggle for some hours in the face of overwhelming numbers. 200 of the Northumberland Fusiliers lay round the wagons and held the Boers off from their prey. With them were the 2 remaining guns, which were a mark for 1,000 Boer riflemen. It was while encouraging by his presence and example the much-tried gunners of this section that the gallant Methuen was wounded by a bullet which broke the bone of his thigh. Lieutenant Venning and all the detachment fell with their general round the guns. An attempt had been made to rally some of the flying troopers at a neighboring kraal, and a small body of Cape Police and Yeomanry, under the command of Major Paris, held out there for some hours. 100 of the Lancashire infantry aided them in their stout defence. But the guns taken by the Boers from Von Donop's convoy had free play now that the British guns were out of action, and they were brought to bear with crushing effect upon both the kraal and the wagon. Further resistance meant a useless slaughter, and orders were given for a surrender. Convoy, ammunition, guns, horses, nothing was saved except the honor of the infantry and the gunners. The losses, 68 killed and 121 wounded, fell chiefly upon these 2 branches of the service. There were 205 unwounded prisoners. This, the last Boer victory in the war, reflected equal credit upon their valor and humanity, qualities which had not always gone hand in hand in our experience of them. Courtesy and attention were extended to the British wounded, and Lord Methuen was sent under charge of his chief medical officer, Colonel Townsend, the doctor as severely wounded as the patient, into Klerksdorp. In De la Rey, we have always found an opponent who was as chivalrous as he was formidable. The remainder of the force reached the Kimberley to Mafeking railway line in the direction of Krypan, the spot where the first bloodshed of the war had occurred some 29 months before. On Lord Methuen himself no blame can rest for this unsuccessful action. If the workman's tool snaps in his hand, he cannot be held responsible for the failure of his task. The troops who misbehaved were none of his training. If you hear anyone slang him, says one of his men, you are to tell them that he is the finest general and the truest gentleman that ever fought in this war. Such was the tone of his own troopers, and such also that of the spokesmen of the nation when they commented upon the disaster in the Houses of Parliament. It was a fine example of British justice and sense of fair play, even in that bitter moment, that to hear his eulogy one would have thought that the occasion had been won when thanks were being returned for a victory. It is a generous public with fine instincts, and Paul Methuen, wounded and broken, still remained in their eyes the heroic soldier and the chivalrous man of honor. The Duet country had been pretty well cleared by the series of drives which have already been described, and Louis Botha's force in the eastern Transvaal had been much diminished by the tactics of Bruce Hamilton and Wool Sampson. Lord Kitchener was able, therefore, to concentrate his troops and his attention upon that widespread western area in which General de la Rey had dealt 2 such shrewd blows within a few weeks of each other. Troops were rapidly concentrated at Klerksdorp. Kekewich, Walter Kitchener, Rawlinson, and Rochfort, with a number of small columns, were ready in the 3rd week of March to endeavor to avenge Lord Methuen. The problem with which Lord Kitchener was confronted was a very difficult one, and he has never shown more originality and audacity than in the fashion in which he handled it. De la Rey's force was scattered over a long tract of country, capable of rapidly concentrating for a blow, but otherwise as intangible and elusive as a phantom army. Were Lord Kitchener simply to launch 10,000 horsemen at him, the result would be a weary ride over illimitable plains without sight of a Boer, unless it were a distant scout upon the extreme horizon. De la Rey and his men would have slipped away to his northern hiding places beyond the Marico River. There was no solid obstacle here, as in the Orange River colony, against which the flying enemy could be rounded up. One line of blockhouses there was, it is true, the one called the Schoonsprut Cordon, which flanked the DLRA country. It flanked it, however, upon the same side as that on which the troops were assembled. If the troops were only on the other side, and DLRA was between them and the blockhouse line, then, indeed, something might be done. But to place the troops there, and then bring them instantly back again, was to put such a strain upon men and horses as had never yet been done upon a large scale in the course of the war. Yet Lord Kitchener knew the mettle of the men whom he commanded, and he was aware that there were no exertions of which the human frame is capable which he might not confidently demand. The precise location of the Boer lagers does not appear to have been known, but it was certain that a considerable number of them were scattered about 30 miles or so to the west of Klerksdorp and the Schoonsprut line. The plan was to march a British force right through them, then spread out into a wide line and come straight back, driving the burghers onto the cordon of blockhouses, which had been strengthened by the arrival of 3 regiments of Highland. But to get to the other side of the Boers, it was necessary to march the columns through by night. It was a hazardous operation, but the secret was well kept, and the movement was so well carried out that the enemy had no time to check it. On the night of Sunday, March 23rd, the British horsemen passed stealthily in column through the DLRA country, and then, spreading out into a line, which from the left wing at Lichtenberg to the right wing at Commando Drift measured a good 80 miles, they proceeded to sweep back upon their traces. In order to reach their positions, the columns had, of course, started at different points of the British blockhouse line, and some had a good deal farther to go than others, while the southern extension of the line was formed by Rochfort's troops, who had moved up from the Vaal. Above him from south to north came Walter Kitchener, Rawlinson, and Kekewich in the order named. On the morning of Monday, March 24th, a line of 80 miles of horsemen, without guns or transport, was sweeping back towards the blockhouses, while the country between was filled with scattered parties of Boers who were seeking for gaps by which to escape. It was soon learned from the first prisoners that DLRA was not within the cordon. His lager had been some distance farther west, but the sight of fugitive horsemen rising and dipping over the rolling veld assured the British that they had something within their net. The catch was, however, by no means as complete as might have been desired. 300 men in khaki slipped through between the 2 columns in the early morning. Another large party escaped to the southwards. Some of the Boers adopted extraordinary devices in order to escape from the ever-narrowing cordon. 3, in charge of some cattle, buried themselves and left a small hole to breathe through with a tube. Some men began to probe with bayonets in the new-turned earth and got immediate and vociferous subterranean yells. Another man tried the same game, and a horse stepped on him. He writhed and reared the horse, and practically the horse found the prisoner for us. But the operations achieved one result, which must have lifted a load of anxiety from Lord Kitchener's mind. 3 15-pounders, 2 pom-poms, and a large amount of ammunition were taken. To Kekewich and the Scottish horse fell the honor of the capture, Colonel Wolves Sampson and Captain Rice heading the charge and pursuit. By this means the constant menace to the blockhouses was lessened, if not entirely removed. 175 Boers were disposed of, nearly all as prisoners, and a considerable quantity of transport was captured. In this operation the troops had averaged from 70 to 80 miles in 26 hours, without change of horses. To such a point had the slow-moving, ponderous British army attained after 2 years' training of that stern drill-master, necessity. The operations had attained some success, but nothing commensurate with the daring of the plan or the exertions of the soldiers. Without an instant's delay, however, Lord Kitchener struck a second blow at his enemy. Before the end of March, Kekewich, Rawlinson, and Walter Kitchener were all upon the trek once more. Their operations were pushed farther to the west than in the last drive, since it was known that on that occasion De la Rey and his main commando had been outside the cordon. It was to one of Walter Kitchener's lieutenants that the honor fell to come in direct contact with the main force of the burghers. This general had moved out to a point about 40 miles west of Klerksdorp. Forming his lager there, he dispatched Cookson on March 30th with 1,700 men to work further westward in the direction of the Harts River. Under Cookson's immediate command were the 2nd Canadian Mounted Infantry, de Mant's Horse, and 4 guns of the 7th RFA. His Lieutenant Keir commanded the 28th Mounted Infantry, the Artillery Mounted Rifles, and 2nd Kitchener's Fighting Scouts. The force was well mounted and carried the minimum of baggage. It was not long before this mobile force found itself within touch of the enemy. The broad wheel made by the passing of a convoy set them off at full cry, and they were soon encouraged by the distant cloud of dust which shrouded the Boer wagons. The advance guard of the column galloped at the top of their speed for 8 miles, and closed in upon the convoy, but found themselves faced by an escort of 500 Boers, who fought a clever rearguard action, and covered their charge with great skill. At the same time, Cookson closed in upon his mounted infantry, while on the other side, De la Rey's main force fell back in order to reinforce the escort. British and Boers were both riding furiously to help their own comrades. The two forces were fairly face to face. Perceiving that he was in front of the whole Boer army, and knowing that he might expect reinforcements, Cookson decided to act upon the defensive. A position was rapidly taken up along the Braksproot, and preparations made to resist the impending attack. The line of defense was roughly the line of the Sprout, but for some reason, probably to establish a crossfire, one advanced position was occupied upon either flank. On the left flank was a farmhouse, which was held by 200 men of the artillery rifles. On the extreme right was another outpost of 24 Canadians and 45 mounted infantry. They occupied no defensible position, and their situation was evidently a most dangerous one, only to be justified by some strong military reason which is not explained by any account of the action. The Boer guns had opened fire, and considerable bodies of the enemy appeared upon the flanks and in front. Their first efforts were devoted towards getting possession of the farmhouse, which would give them a point d'appui from which they could turn the whole line. Some 500 of them charged on horseback, but were met by a very steady fire from the artillery rifles, while the guns raked them with shrapnel. They reached a point within 500 yards of the building, but the fire was too hot, and they wheeled round in rapid retreat. Dismounting in a mealie patch, they skirmished up towards the farmhouse once more, but they were again checked by the fire of the defenders and by a pom-pom which Colonel Keir had brought up. No progress whatever was made by the attack in this quarter. In the meantime, the fate which might have been foretold had befallen the isolated detachment of Canadians and 28th Mounted Infantry upon the extreme right. Bruce Carruthers, the Canadian officer in command, behaved with the utmost gallantry and was splendidly seconded by his men. Overwhelmed by vastly superior numbers, amid a perfect hail of bullets they fought like heroes to the end. There have been few finer instances of heroism in the course of the campaign, says the reticent Kitchener in his official dispatch. Of the Canadians, 18 were hit out of 21, and the mounted infantry hard by lost 30 out of 45 before they surrendered. This advantage gained upon the right flank was of no assistance to the Boers in breaking the British line. The fact that it was so makes it the more difficult to understand why this outpost was so exposed. The burghers had practically surrounded Cookson's force, and De la Rey and Kemp urged on the attack, but their artillery fire was dominated by the British guns, and no weak point could be found in the defense. At 1 o'clock, the attack had been begun, and at 5:30, it was finally abandoned, and De la Rey was in full retreat. That he was in no sense routed is shown by the fact that Cookson did not attempt to follow him up or to capture his guns, but at least he had failed in his purpose and had lost more heavily than in any engagement which he had yet fought. The moral effect of his previous victories had also been weakened, and his burghers had learned, if they had illusions upon the subject, that the men who fled at Tweebosch were not typical troopers of the British Army. Altogether, it was a well-fought and useful action, though it cost the British force some 200 casualties, of which 35 were fatal. Cookson's force stood to arms all night until the arrival of Walter Kitchener's men in the morning. General Ian Hamilton, who had acted for some time as chief of the staff to Lord Kitchener, had arrived on April 8th at Klerksdorp to take supreme command of the whole operations against de la Rey. Early in April, the three main British columns had made a rapid cast round without success. To the very end, the better intelligence and the higher mobility seemed to have remained upon the side of the Boers, who could always force a fight when they wished and escape when they wished. Occasionally, however, they forced one at the wrong time, as in the instance which I am about to describe. Hamilton had planned a drive to cover the southern portion of de la Rey's country, and for this purpose, with Hartbeesfontein for his center, he was maneuvering his columns so as to swing them into line, and then sweep back towards Klerksdorp. Kekewich, Rawlinson, and Walter Kitchener were all maneuvering for this purpose. The Boers, however, gamed to the last, although they were aware that their leaders had gone in retreat, and that peace was probably due within a few days, determined to have one last gallant fall with the British column. The forces of Kekewich were the farthest to the westward, and also, as the burghers thought, the most isolated, and it was upon them, accordingly, that the attack was made. In the morning of April 11th, at a place called Roewal, the enemy, who had moved up from Wolmeronstad 1900 strong, under Kemp and Vermaas, fell with the utmost impetuosity upon the British column. There was no preliminary skirmishing, and a single gallant charge by 1,500 Boers both opened and ended the engagement. I was just saying to the staff officer that there were no Boers within 20 miles, says one who was present, when we heard a roar of musketry and saw a lot of men galloping down on us. The British were surprised but not shaken by this unexpected apparition. I never saw a more splendid attack. They kept a distinct line, says the eyewitness. Another spectator says, they came on in one long line, 4 deep and knee to knee. It was an old-fashioned cavalry charge, and the fact that it got as far as it did shows that we have overrated the stopping power of modern rifles. They came for a good 500 yards under direct fire and were only turned within 100 of the British line. The yeomanry, the Scottish horse, and the constabulary poured a steady fire upon the advancing wave of horsemen, and the guns opened with case at 200 yards. The Boers were stopped, staggered, and turned. Their fire, or rather the covering fire of those who had not joined in the charge, had caused some 50 casualties, but their own losses were very much more severe. The fierce Podjeter fell just in front of the British gun. "Thank goodness he is dead," cried one of his wounded burghers, "for he stjamboked me into the firing line this morning." 50 dead, and a great number of wounded were left upon the field of battle. Rawlinson's column came up on Kekewich's left, and the Boer flight became a rout, for they were chased for 20 miles, and their 2 guns were captured. It was a brisk and decisive little engagement, and it closed the Western campaign, leaving the last trick as well as the game to the credit of the British. From this time until the end, there was a gleaning of prisoners, but little fighting in de la Rey's country. The most noteworthy event being a surprise visit to Schweizer, Renneke, by Roquefort, by which some 60 prisoners were taken, and afterwards the drive of Ian Hamilton's forces against the Mafeking railway line, by which no fewer than 364 prisoners were secured. In this difficult and well-managed operation, the gaps between the British columns were concealed by the lighting of long veld fires and the discharge of rifles by scattered scouts. The newly arrived Australian Commonwealth regiments gave a brilliant start to the military history of their united country by the energy of their marching and the thoroughness of their entrenching. Upon May 29th, only 2 days before the final declaration of peace, a raid was made by a few Boers upon the native cattle reserves near Frederickstad. A handful of horsemen pursued them, and were ambushed by a considerable body of the enemy in some hilly country 10 miles from the British lines. Most of the pursuers got away in safety, but young Sutherland, second lieutenant of the Seaforths, and only a few months from Eton, found himself separated from his horse and in a hopeless position. Scorning to surrender, the lad actually fought his way upon foot for over a mile before he was shot down by the horsemen who circled round him. Well might the Boer commander declare that in the whole course of the war he had seen no finer example of British courage. It is indeed sad that at this last instant a young life should be thrown away. But Sutherland died in a noble fashion for a noble cause, and many inglorious years would be a poor substitute for the example and tradition which such a death will leave behind. Chapter 39. The End. It only remains in one short chapter to narrate the progress of the peace negotiations, the ultimate settlement, and the final consequences of this long-drawn war. However disheartening the successive incidents may have been in which the Boers were able to inflict heavy losses upon us and to renew their supplies of arms and ammunition, it was none the less certain that their numbers were waning and that the inevitable end was steadily approaching. With mathematical precision, the scientific soldier in Pretoria, with his web of barbed wire radiating out over the whole country, was week by week wearing them steadily down. And yet, after the recent victory of De la Rey, and various braggadocio pronouncements from the refugees at The Hague, it was somewhat of a surprise to the British public when it was announced upon March 22nd that the acting government of the Transvaal, consisting of Messrs. Schalkberger, Lucas Meyer, Reitz, Jacobi, Kroeg, and Van Velden, had come into Middelburg and requested to be forwarded by train to Pretoria for the purpose of discussing terms of peace with Lord Kitchener. A thrill of hope ran through the Empire at the news, but so doubtful did the issue seem that none of the preparations were relaxed, which would ensure a vigorous campaign in the immediate future. In the South African, as in the Peninsular and in the Crimean Wars, it may truly be said that Great Britain was never so ready to fight as at the dawning of peace. At least 2 years of failure and experience are needed to turn a civilian and commercial nation into a military power. In spite of the optimistic pronouncements of Mr. D. Fisher and the absurd forecasts of Dr. Lades, the power of the Boers was really broken, and they had come in with the genuine intention of surrender. In a race with such individuality, it was not enough that the government should form its conclusion. It was necessary for them to persuade their burghers that the game was really up, and that they had no choice but to throw down their well-worn rifles and their ill-filled bandoliers. For this purpose, a long series of negotiations had to be entered into, which put a strain upon the complacency of the authorities in South Africa, and upon the patience of the attentive public at home. Their ultimate success shows that this complacency and this patience were eminently the right attitude to adopt. On March 23rd, the Transvaal representatives were dispatched to Kroonstad for the purpose of opening up the matter with Steyn and De Wet. Messengers were sent to communicate with these two leaders, but had they been British columns instead of fellow countrymen, they could not have found greater difficulty in running them to earth. At last, however, at the end of the month, the message was conveyed, and resulted in the appearance of De Wet, De la Rey, and Steyn at the British outposts at Klerksdorp. The other delegates had come north again from Kroonstad, and all were united in the same small town, which, by a whimsical fate, had suddenly become the center both for the making of peace and for the prosecution of the war. With the eyes of the whole world fixed upon its insignificant litter of houses, on April 11th, after repeated conferences, both parties moved on to Pretoria, and the most skeptical observers began to confess that there was something in the negotiations after all. After conferring with Lord Kitchener, the Boer leaders upon April 18th left Pretoria again, and rode out to the commandos to explain the situation to them. The result of this mission was that 2 delegates were chosen from each body in the field, who assembled at Vereeniging upon May 15th for the purpose of settling the question by vote. Never was a high matter of state decided in so democratic a fashion. Up to that period, the Boer leaders had made a succession of tentative suggestions, each of which had been put aside by the British government. Their first had been that they should merely concede those points which had been at issue at the beginning of the war. This was set aside. The second was that they should be allowed to consult their friends in Europe. This also was refused. The next was that an armistice should be granted, but again Lord Kitchener was obdurate. A definite period was suggested within which the burghers should make their final choice between surrender and a war which must finally exterminate them as a people. It was tacitly understood, if not definitely promised, that the conditions which the British government would be prepared to grant would not differ much in essentials from those which had been refused by the Boers a 12-month before. After the Middelburg interview. On May 15th, the Boer conference opened at Vereeniging. 64 delegates from the commandos met with the military and political chiefs of the late republics, the whole amounting to 150 persons. A more singular gathering has not met in our time. There was Botha, the young lawyer, who had found himself by a strange turn of fate commanding a victorious army in a great war. De Wet was there, with his grim mouth and sun-browned face. De la Rey also, with the grizzled beard and the strong aquiline features. There too were the politicians, the grey-bearded, genial Wrights, a little graver than when he looked upon the whole matter as an immense joke, and the unfortunate Steyn stumbling and groping, a broken and ruined man. The burly Lucas Meyer, smart young smuts fresh from the siege of Okipi. Byers from the north, Kemp the dashing cavalry leader, Muller the hero of many fights, all these with many others of their son, blackened, gaunt, hard, featured comrades were grouped within the great tent of Vereeniging. The discussions were heated and prolonged, but the logic of facts was inexorable, and the cold, still voice of common sense had more power than all the ravings of enthusiasts. The vote showed that the great majority of the delegates were in favor of surrender upon the terms offered by the British government. On May 31st, this resolution was notified to Lord Kitchener, and at 10:30 of the same night, the delegates arrived at Pretoria and set their names to the Treaty of Peace. After 2 years, 7.5 months of hostilities, the Dutch republics had acquiesced in their own destruction, and the whole of South Africa, from Cape Town to the Zambesi, had been added to the British Empire. The great struggle had cost us 20,000 lives and 100,000 stricken men, with 200 millions of money, but, apart from a peaceful South Africa, it had won for us a national resuscitation of spirit, and a closer union with our great colonies, which could in no other way have been attained. We had hoped that we were a solid empire when we engaged in the struggle, but we knew that we were when we emerged from it. In that change lies an ample recompense for all the blood and treasure spent. The following were in brief the terms of surrender. 1. That the burghers lay down their arms and acknowledge themselves subjects of Edward VII. 2. That all prisoners taking the oath of allegiance be returned. 3. Doyle, that their liberty and property be inviolate. 4. That an amnesty be granted, save in special cases. 5. That the Dutch language be allowed in schools and law courts. 6. That rifles be allowed if registered. 7. That self-government be granted as soon as possible. 8. That no franchise be granted for natives until after self-government died. 9. That no special land tax be levied. 10. That the people be helped to reoccupy the farms. 11. That £3 million be given to help the farmers. 12. That the rebels be disfranchised and their leaders tried, on condition that no death penalty be inflicted. These terms were practically the same as those which had been refused by Botha in March 1901. 13 months of useless warfare had left the situation as it was. It had been a war of surprises, but the surprises have unhappily been hitherto invariably unpleasant ones. Now at last, the balance swung the other way. For in all the long paradoxical history of South African strife, there is nothing more wonderful than the way in which these two sturdy and unemotional races clasped hands the instant that the fight was done. The fact is in itself a final answer to the ill-natured critics of the continent. Men do not so easily grasp a hand which is reddened with the blood of women and children. From all parts as the commandos came in, there was welcome news of the fraternization between them and the soldiers, while the Boer leaders, as loyal to their new ties as they had been to their old ones, exerted themselves to promote good feeling among their people. A few weeks seemed to do more to lessen racial bitterness than some of us had hoped for in as many years. One can but pray that it will last. The surrenders amounted in all to 20,000 men, and showed that in all parts of the seat of war the enemy had more men in the field than we had imagined, a fact which may take the sting out of several of our later mishaps. About 12,000 surrendered in the Transvaal, 6,000 in the Orange River Colony, and about 2,000 in the Cape Colony, showing that the movement in the rebel districts had always been more vexatious than formidable. A computation of the prisoners of war, the surrenders, the mercenaries, and the casualties shows that the total forces to which we were opposed were certainly not fewer than 75,000 well-armed mounted men, while they may have considerably exceeded that number. No wonder that the Boer leaders showed great confidence at the outset of the war. That the heavy losses caused us by the war were borne without a murmur is surely evidence enough how deep was the conviction of the nation that the war was not only just but essential, that the possession of South Africa and the unity of the empire were at stake. Could it be shown, or were it even remotely possible, that ministers had incurred so immense a responsibility and entailed such tremendous sacrifices upon their people without adequate cause? Is it not certain that, the task once done, an explosion of rage from the deceived and the bereaved would have driven them forever from public life? Among high and low, in England, in Scotland, in Ireland, in the great colonies, how many high hopes had been crushed, how often the soldier's son had gone forth and never returned, or come back maimed and stricken in the pride of his youth. Everywhere was the voice of pity and sorrow, but nowhere that of reproach. The deepest instincts of the nation told it that it must fight and win, or forever abdicate its position in the world. Through dark days which brought out the virtues of our race as nothing has done in our generation, we struggled grimly on until the light had fully broken once again. And of all gifts that God has given to Britain, there is none to compare with those days of sorrow, for it was in them that the nation was assured of its unity, and learned for all time that blood is stronger to bind than salt water is to part. The only difference in the point of view of the Briton from Britain, and the Briton from the ends of the earth, was that the latter with the energy of youth was more whole-souled in the imperial cause. Who has seen that army and can forget it? Its spirit, its picturesqueness, above all, what it stands for in the future history of the world. Cowboys from the vast plains of the north, west, gentlemen who ride hard with the Quorn or the Belvoir, gillies from the Sutherland deer, forests, bushmen from the back blocks of Australia, exquisites of the Raleigh Club or the Bachelors, hard men from Ontario, dandy sportsmen from India and Ceylon, the horsemen of New Zealand, the wiry South African irregulars. These are the reserves whose existence was chronicled in no blue book, and whose appearance came as a shock to the pedant soldiers of the continent who had sneered so long at our little army, since long years of peace have caused them to forget its exploits. On the plains of South Africa, in common danger and in common privation, the blood brotherhood of the empire was sealed. So much for the empire. But what of South Africa? There in the end we must reap as we sow. If we are worthy of the trust, it will be left to us. If we are unworthy of it, it will be taken away. Kruger's downfall should teach us that it is not rifles but justice which is the title deed of a nation. The British flag under our best administrators will mean clean government, honest laws, liberty, and equality to all men. So long as it continues to do so, we shall hold South Africa. When, out of fear or greed, we fall from that ideal, we may know that we are stricken with that disease, which has killed every great empire before us. Und da,